Your shift is over. What are you still doing here? Richard Whitmore asked Annie, shining his flashlight directly into her face. The harsh white beam struck her eyes, making her flinch. She quickly turned her head away, raising one hand to shield her face while clutching a stack of papers tightly against her chest with the other. Could you please stop shining that in my face? Her voice was hoarse with exhaustion. Richard lowered the flashlight and directed the beam toward the concrete wall beside her. He had expected the 47th floor of Horizon 1 to be completely deserted at 2 in the morning. The construction workers had left hours earlier. The overnight security team patrolled only the lower floors, and the freight elevators had already been locked according to schedule. Yet behind a massive support column, surrounded by tarps and lengths of steel that had not yet been installed, a female custodian was kneeling on the floor. Dozens of sheets of paper surrounded her. Some had been arranged in neat rows. Others had been taped together to form large technical drawings. On the wall behind her, white chalk lines connected into an intricate network. Her mop and cleaning cart had been abandoned nearly 20 feet away. Richard looked from them to Annie. I asked you a question. I heard you. Then answer me. Annie blinked several times until her vision cleared. I finished my work. I stayed to finish something else. Something else? Richard stepped forward. Annie immediately stood and moved between him and the papers spread across the floor. Stop. Richard halted, not because her command carried any real authority, but because he was not accustomed to hearing an employee speak to him in that tone, especially not a custodian, especially not at a construction site bearing the name of his corporation, and certainly not at 2 in the morning, when that woman was standing among documents she should never have been allowed to touch. Move aside, he said. No. Richard's expression turned cold. Do you know who you're speaking to? Yes. Then you should understand that this is not a request, and you should look down before taking another step. Richard lowered the flashlight. The beam traveled over Annie's worn work shoes and stopped just inches from the toe of his own. A large sheet of paper lay directly in front of him, covered with numbers, load-bearing symbols, and handwritten calculations. Every line had been drawn with precision. Critical figures had been circled in red ink. The margins were crowded with small but carefully organized notes. If Richard took half a step farther, his dust-covered construction boot would land directly on it. These are the only complete calculations I have, Annie said. One footprint could destroy 6 months of work. Richard slowly moved his foot back. For the first time, he studied what lay around her. Structural drawings, load distribution diagrams, foundation markings, material ratios, calculations involving shear force and bending moments. Several pages had been joined together to create a complete cross-section of the western core. On the wall, white chalk lines ran from the foundation to Horizon 1's central frame. Beside the original design was a second plan, with the support columns repositioned and the load redistributed along a different path. A steel ruler lay beside a handheld calculator. Resting on top of a worn notebook was an old brass compass, its metal darkened with age. Richard was no longer merely irritated. He was becoming suspicious. A custodian did not simply appear in the middle of a restricted construction site at 2 in the morning, surrounded by technical plans for a project valued at nearly $20 billion, and order the company's owner not to come closer. Everything in front of him could be evidence of stolen data, or something worse. It might be part of the same sabotage that had caused the senior architectural team to walk out only hours earlier. What is all this? Richard asked. An alternative structural plan. For Horizon 1? Yes. Richard studied her for several seconds before letting out a short, humorless laugh. You expect me to believe that a custodian developed an alternative structural plan for the largest project in this company's history? I don't need you to believe me. You're standing in a restricted area at 2 in the morning, surrounded by my company's technical documents. I know where I am, and you've redrawn my project on the wall, because every computer in the design office has been locked, and the original files are gone. Richard's expression changed instantly. He stepped half a pace closer, carefully avoiding the papers this time. Who told you that? No one. Then how do you know? I cleaned the design offices. I saw them packing. I saw hard drives being removed from the computers. I saw empty filing cabinets. You entered the offices after they left? That is where I was assigned to clean. Did you open any filing cabinets? No. Did you copy any data? No. Have you contacted Charles Vance since he left the company? Annie frowned. No. Did someone pay you to come back here tonight? The exhaustion vanished from Annie's face. She stared at Richard as though she could not believe what he had just asked. Pay me to do what? That is exactly what I'm trying to find out. Richard swept the flashlight over the papers. My senior architectural team resigned together. Critical files disappeared less than a day before the national bid presentation. Then I find you here at 2 in the morning with confidential documents spread across the floor. He looked directly at her. What would you think if you were in my position? Annie clenched her hands. I might read the documents before accusing someone. I haven't accused you. You just asked whether someone paid me. Because I need to know what you're doing. I'm trying to save the project the people you trusted abandoned. Richard's face hardened. Watch your words. Why? Because I clean floors, so I'm not allowed to say something you don't want to hear? Because you're making serious claims without evidence. The evidence is right beneath your feet. Richard looked down at the papers. Where did you get them? Annie did not answer immediately. Her hesitation deepened the suspicion in his eyes. Answer me. From the trash. Which trash? The bins outside the design offices. Richard's voice suddenly thundered across the unfinished floor. You took confidential documents from the design department's trash? They threw them away. That did not give you the right to take them. I never said I had the right. Then what do you call this? Recovering what they deliberately left behind. You do not get to decide which company documents should be preserved. Then what was I supposed to do? Annie shot back. Push them into the shredder and pretend I never saw them? You should have reported it. I did report it. Richard stopped. Annie took a step toward him. Her eyes were red from exhaustion, but anger made them burn. 3 months ago, I found a smaller error in one of the load schedules. I took it to Charles Vance. And? He didn't read it. Her voice trembled slightly. He looked at my uniform and asked who had given me permission to touch the documents on the table. I told him I had studied architecture, and that I only wanted him to check one number. Richard did not take his eyes off her. What did he say? Annie gave a dry, bitter laugh. He told me to clean the table and stop questioning the people who were allowed to sit around it. The final words burst from her as though they had been trapped inside her for far too long. I stood there holding that paper while everyone in the room stared at me as though I had forgotten my place. No one checked the number. No one asked how I had noticed it. They only wanted me gone before the clients walked in. Richard said nothing for several seconds, but the suspicion had not left him. That still doesn't explain why you're here in the middle of the night. Because they won't let me near any of this during the day. Or because no one is here at night to see you taking documents. The question left Annie motionless. A cold gust swept through the windowless floor, making the corners of the papers flutter. She stared at Richard for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. There was no caution left in it, no more effort to remain patient. Do you honestly believe I came here with some hidden agenda? Richard did not answer. Annie pointed at her faded work uniform. I have been working since 6 o'clock this evening. I cleaned 40 offices, scrubbed 12 bathrooms, and emptied the trash of people who earn more in 1 hour than I make in an entire month. Her voice began to rise. I waited until everyone left, and then I came back here. Not to steal, not to sell documents. I stayed because thousands of people could lose their jobs tomorrow if the bid is rejected. Richard frowned. You can't know that for certain, but I know the numbers don't match. You believe you understand this project better than the entire architectural team? I understand enough to know that the steel delivered to the Western Core does not meet the specifications in the final submission. Richard looked toward the rows of steel beams stacked beyond the temporary barrier. Annie bent down to retrieve a sheet of paper. Don't touch it, he said immediately. She stopped, anger flaring in her eyes. Are you going to accuse me every time I touch a page? I'm trying to determine how much information you've accessed. They walked past this information every day, and you collected it, because no one else would look. Annie's shout echoed through the concrete columns. She was breathing hard. Her fists were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. They all walked through here in polished shoes and expensive coats, carrying titles so long they needed 2 lines on their business cards. They saw the numbers, but they never saw the mistake. And when I saw it, they told me to go back to my mop. Richard held her Gaza. Annie bent down, slowly picked up a sheet, and held it in the beam of his flashlight. This material schedule was thrown away 3 weeks ago. This column specifies steel with a higher yield strength. She pointed to a line of figures, but the markings stamped on the beams delivered to the site show a lower grade. This could be an outdated schedule. I thought so too. Annie pointed to 4 other pages arranged beside it. So I checked the later revisions. All four continue to list the higher grade steel, but the connection calculations were altered to accommodate weaker material. Richard bent down to examine them. Are you saying someone knew the material was below specification and changed the calculations to conceal it? I'm saying there is a discrepancy. That is a criminal accusation. No, it is arithmetic. Annie looked directly at him, and arithmetic does not care whether the person doing it is the chief architect or the person emptying the trash. Richard snatched the page from her hand. He examined every figure, then moved the flashlight across the remaining sheets. This time, Annie did not stop him. Where did this ratio come from? He asked. The inspection report for material lot 17. That document wasn't in the trash. It was attached beneath a delivery report that an engineer left on his desk. You read documents on an employee's desk? I saw a number circled in red, and you took it upon yourself to write it down? Yes. That was internal data. It was also the number showing that the Western Core might not support the load promised in the official submission. Richard spun toward her. Don't exaggerate. I'm not exaggerating. Annie grabbed a piece of chalk and strode toward the wall. This is the approved structure. She pointed to the diagram on the left. The load from the western tower travels into the central frame through 3 transfer points. According to the official documents, those connections use material with a higher strength rating. She tapped the chalk against a row of numbers, but with the steel that was actually delivered, the deflection increases. The shear force at this connection exceeds the permitted limit once the building reaches its full service load. Richard followed the diagram. What he remembered from his civil engineering studies was enough for him to recognize that Annie was not inventing any of this. The chalk lines followed a clear logic. The ratios connected correctly. She had even marked specific points that could be verified at the site. What is the section on the right? He asked. The alternative plan. You designed it yourself? Yes. You changed the positions of the support columns to redistribute the load. You added 2 more connection points at the podium. That would allow us to use the steel already delivered without demolishing the entire foundation. Richard studied it more carefully. This change would delay construction. 11 days. The cost? Approximately $32 million. Richard gave a cold laugh. You say $32 million as though it were pocket change. It is less than the company will lose if the core has to be dismantled after the review board discovers the problem. And you calculated all of this by yourself? Not in one night. Annie looked down at the pages surrounding her feet. 6 months. Richard turned to her. 6 months? I started keeping records when I noticed the first error. While continuing to work as a custodian? Yes. When did you sleep? Annie did not answer. Richard studied the dark circles beneath her eyes, then the thin bandage wrapped around her thumb. A streak, 7-nighted, wrapped around her thumb. A streak of white chalk marked the cuff of her uniform. The sole of her right shoe had worn down unevenly. A small tear at the knee of her pants had been repaired with black thread. But sympathy was not enough to erase his caution. Does anyone know you've been doing this? No. No one at all? No. Then why should I believe this wasn't prepared to be sold to one of our competitors? Annie closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, the hurt in her expression was stronger than her anger. Because if I intended to sell it, I would not have taped it to your concrete wall. Richard said nothing. Annie stepped closer. You want to know why I'm here at 2 in the morning? Her voice caught, but every word remained clear. Because this is the only time no one throws me out. She pointed toward the wall. During the day, I'm not allowed into meetings. I'm not allowed to use the computers. I'm not allowed to touch the drawings. I'm not even allowed to finish a sentence before people see my uniform and decide I could never understand the numbers in front of me. Annie quickly wiped at the corner of one eye. I work at night because darkness doesn't ask which school I attended. This wall doesn't laugh when I pick up a piece of chalk. Numbers don't tell me to go back to my mop. Richard stared at her. Annie's voice broke. I tried to warn them. Do you understand? I tried. She struck one hand against her chest, but no one listened. And now the people who were paid hundreds of thousands of dollars have walked away with every original file. Only then did all of you panic. Only then did you come here in the middle of the night searching for whatever they left behind. She pointed at the papers. But I have been here for 6 months. If Annie's courage and determination moved you, please like this video and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about truth, justice, and people who refuse to be overlooked. Another gust swept through the floor, sending one page sliding toward the open edge. Annie immediately ran after it and dropped to her knees, catching it before it could blow away. When she stood again, her hands were trembling violently, whether from the cold, exhaustion, or the emotions that had finally broken free. Even she could not have said. Richard stared at her for a long time. Annie turned back toward the wall, but before placing the chalk against the unfinished line, she glanced down at Richard's construction dust-covered shoes. "Don't step on the load tables." Richard looked at the pages covering nearly every inch of the concrete floor. "I learned that lesson the first time." The first time was less than an hour ago. It has been an unusually long hour. The corner of Annie's mouth moved. For a moment she almost smiled. Then her eyes fell on Charles Vance's approval code at the bottom of one of the documents. The softness that had briefly appeared on her face vanished. Memories returned the contempt in his eyes. The day she had been forced out of the design office, and the 6 months she had spent working in secret because no one had been willing to listen. Annie tightened her grip on the chalk and pressed it against the wall. Richard crouched beside the leather folder. This time, he was so careful that he seemed to inspect every inch of the floor before lowering one knee. He began comparing the specifications in the official documents with the figures Annie had written. 10 minutes passed, then 20. At first, Richard questioned her like a man searching for a weakness. Then his tone changed. He began asking because he truly wanted to understand. Why does the shear force increase faster than expected at this point? Annie did not turn around. Because the official plan uses the wrong stiffness value for the connecting beam. And this coefficient? It was taken from the specifications for grade 65 steel, then applied to a connection using grade 50. Richard circled the number with his pen. Could we reinforce this connection instead of changing the entire load path? We could. Annie drew another chalk line. But the excess load would shift to the southern column. You wouldn't eliminate the danger. You would only move it somewhere harder to detect. Richard checked the calculations again, then drew a firm line through a figure in the official summary. Did you calculate that option too? The page with the blue border, just to the left of your foot. Richard looked down. The toe of his shoe was less than an inch from the edge of the paper. He immediately pulled his foot back. Annie kept her eyes on the wall. You almost had to learn the first lesson again. I didn't step on it this time. Remarkable progress. Richard looked up at her. For a brief moment, the tension in his face eased, but that rare moment was quickly interrupted by footsteps approaching from the far end of the construction floor. It was not one person. At least 3 people were coming. Metal latches clattered against equipment cases. Small wheels rolled over the concrete, growing louder with every second. On the deserted floor, close to 3 in the morning, the sounds made Annie stop writing at once. The chalk remained pressed against the wall, but her hand began to tremble. Richard noticed. You've stood up to me for almost an hour, he said. 3 engineers cannot be more frightening than that. Annie did not look at him. You don't look at me the way they're going to. Richard stood. An hour ago I thought you might be stealing company data. Annie spun toward him. That does absolutely nothing to calm me down. But I examined your work. Richard picked up the leather folder. And they will have to examine it too. You think saying that will be enough? Annie's voice suddenly rose. They'll walk over here, see this uniform, and wonder why a woman who cleans floors is standing in front of a structural diagram. They won't look at the numbers first. They'll look at me first. Richard started to respond, but Annie did not give him the chance. I know that look. She pointed toward the approaching figures. I saw it in the classroom when I couldn't afford a new set of drafting tools. I saw it in Charles Vance's office when he told me to go back to my mop, and I saw it on your face when you found me here. Richard tightened his grip on the folder. You're right. Annie stopped. He looked directly at her. At first, I saw the uniform before I saw the work. She had not expected him to admit it. Richard continued. I cannot change what I did. I can only decide what I do next. 3 figures emerged from behind the rows of concrete columns. The first was a woman in her 50s with short, silver-streaked hair. She pulled a specialized computer case behind her. 2 men followed. One carried measuring equipment, while the other held a thick volume of building codes against his chest. They approached with the hurried, irritated expressions of experts who had been dragged out of bed in the middle of the night. All 3 looked at Richard first. Then they saw Annie, her faded custodial uniform, her worn shoes, the chalk in her hand. The technical drawings spread across the floor around her. Surprise appeared on all 3 faces. Annie felt her chest tighten. exactly as she had expected. The woman at the front frowned. Mr. Whitmore, who discovered the problem? Richard did not answer immediately. He stepped aside, allowing the light to fall across Annie and the entire diagram behind her. And Nicole. All three engineers looked at Annie again. This time, they stared longer. Richard placed the leather folder beside the calculations. She will present her findings. You will verify every number. The oldest man narrowed his eyes. She did these calculations? Yes. He looked at Annie's uniform, then turned toward Richard. Do you have a problem with the calculations? Richard asked. Or with the person holding the chalk? The man hesitated. I want to know whether she has the proper qualifications or a professional license. Annie lowered her eyes. She had known the question was coming. Richard looked toward her, but Annie answered before he could speak. I don't have a professional license. The man exhaled, as though her answer had confirmed everything he had already assumed. Then we are wasting our time. No. Annie spoke so softly that he nearly missed it. The man turned back. She raised her head. Her eyes were red with exhaustion, but she no longer avoided his gaze. I don't have a license, but those beams outside are still grade 50 steel, whether you approve of the person who discovered it or not. The man frowned. Annie moved toward the diagram. The final summary still uses the specifications for grade 65 steel. The connection calculations still combine two different standards, and the central frame still exceeds the allowable shear limit when the building reaches its full service load. Her voice grew stronger. You may look down on me after you finish checking my work. But first, prove that my numbers are wrong. The silver-haired woman studied Annie closely. You calculated all of this yourself? Yes. Without software? Yes. Without a complete structural model? I reconstructed it from discarded drafts, material reports, the stamps on the beams, and whatever remained in the documents they threw away. The woman looked at the pages covering the floor. How long did this take? 6 months. The doubt on her face changed. It did not disappear completely, but it was joined by genuine interest. The older man shook his head. 6 months of work does not make someone a structural engineer. Annie turned toward him. And 10 years of experience does not make a wrong number correct. Her voice rang through the concrete columns. I am not asking you to recognize me. I am not asking you to give me a title. I am only asking you to stop staring at this uniform long enough to examine the building that thousands of people are depending on. Annie's hands began to tremble. Her voice started to break, but she refused to stop. I tried to warn them 3 months ago. No one listened. I was sent down to the parking levels because I touched a design drawing. I worked alone every night because nighttime was the only time no one threw me out. She pointed at the wall. So don't stand there and ask me why I don't have a license. Ask why the people who did have licenses allowed this to happen. No one answered. Richard looked at the 3 engineers. You heard her. His voice became firm. No one here is evaluating Annie Cole's credentials. We are evaluating the structural integrity of Horizon 1. The woman set down her computer case. All right, let's begin. Annie looked at her as though she was not certain she had heard correctly. The woman unlocked the equipment case. I will test every load path. If you are wrong, I will tell you directly. That is exactly what I want. And if you are right, she paused, her gaze shifting toward Charles Vance's approval code. Then we are dealing with something far more serious than a flawed design. The older man remained reluctant, but he placed the building code volume on the floor. The 3rd engineer opened his measuring equipment and connected it to the computer. Annie turned back toward the wall. She was still cold. Her legs still ached after hours of standing. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep. Deep inside, she remained afraid that one small mistake would be enough to make everyone turn their backs on her. But for the first time in 6 months, she was not standing outside a meeting room. No one was telling her to clean the table. No one was forcing the mop back into her hands. She stood before the diagram she had reconstructed herself, while the people with the authority to confirm the truth waited for her to speak. Annie drew a deep breath. We'll begin with the Western Foundation Assembly. She placed the chalk against the lowest line. Before you test anything, you need to disregard the value in the final summary. The woman sat in front of the computer. Why? Annie pointed to the 2 steel grades written beside each other. Because the value on top describes the steel the company believes it purchased. She moved the chalk to the number below it. And this is the steel that was actually delivered to the site. The 3rd engineer entered the data. Several seconds later, he frowned. Wait. The older man moved closer. What is it? With grade 50 steel, the deflection exceeds the threshold in the preliminary model. He turned toward Annie. What reduction factor did you use? None during the first run. Why not? Because I wanted you to see the real load before anyone tried to make the result look better. The woman looked up. Run it again using the inspection data from material lot 17. Annie immediately pointed toward a page marked with a blue edge. It's there. Richard bent down, carefully held the page by two corners, and handed it to her. More figures were entered. The sound of rapid typing filled the unfinished floor. A graph appeared on the screen. The engineer operating the computer suddenly stopped. That can't be right. Richard stepped closer. What is it? The woman looked at the screen, then at Annie's diagram. Her values match. The older man immediately bent over the computer. Run it again. The system has already run it twice. Run it a third time. Annie stood perfectly still. She hardly dared to breathe. The computer processed the data once more. The result did not change. The woman pressed her lips together, her expression turning grave. The shear force at the central connection exceeds the allowable limit. If the old design is submitted, the review board will find it. Richard looked at Annie. What about the alternative plan? We haven't tested it yet, the woman answered. But the problem she identified is real. Annie's shoulders trembled. She had imagined that being proven right would feel like victory. Instead, the first emotion that came was pain. 6 months. 6 months of ridicule, rejection, and working alone in the dark. And in the end, it had taken only a few minutes to prove that she had been right all along. Annie turned her face away and quickly wiped away the tear that escaped down her cheek. The older man saw it. He was no longer looking at her uniform. He was looking at the chalk lines on the wall. Who approved the connection values? Richard opened the leather folder and turned to the final page. Charles Vance's authorization code appeared at the bottom. Richard placed one finger over it. The man who left the company a few hours ago. The woman looked at him. Do you believe this was sabotage? Richard tightened his grip on the folder. I'm not drawing any conclusions yet. He studied the small alterations scattered across the documents. But someone combined two standards skillfully enough to get them through an ordinary review. And if Miss Cole had not reconstructed the calculations? The woman asked. Richard looked at Annie. She stood before the wall with the chalk still in her hand, her face pale with exhaustion. Tomorrow, we would have submitted a design that could bring down the entire project. Annie slowly shook her head. Not just the project. Everyone turned toward her. If construction continued on that core, Charles Vance would not be the one who paid the final price. Her voice had become hoarse. The workers would. Their families would. So would every person who ever walked into that building. Richard stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned toward the three engineers. Test the alternative plan. The older man looked at him. Right now? Richard checked his watch. Right now. That could take until morning. Then we work until morning. He looked at each of them in turn. No one leaves this floor until we know exactly what Annie Cole saved us from. Annie stopped when she heard her name. Not the custodian. Not the woman in the uniform. Annie Cole. For the first time, her name had been spoken in front of people with power, as the name of the person who had uncovered the truth. She looked down at the chalk in her hand, trying to make her fingers stop trembling. Richard walked over to her. Are you ready to explain the alternative plan? Annie looked at him. Do you believe me now? Richard did not answer immediately. He looked at Charles Vance's approval code, at the results on the computer screen, and then at the woman who had worked alone for 6 months. I believe you saw what every one of us failed to see. Annie drew in a deep breath. Then don't ignore what comes next. She turned back toward the wall and placed the chalk against the second diagram. To save Horizon 1, we have to change the entire path the load takes through the central frame. The three engineers moved closer. Richard stood directly behind them. As the sound of typing filled the floor again, he was no longer trying to prove Annie wrong. He was searching for evidence of what Charles Vance had done, and why he had been willing to gamble with thousands of lives merely to hide a set of numbers on paper. The footsteps came closer, followed by the sound of a rolling equipment case crossing the concrete. Richard turned toward the open passage as a man in a gray jacket entered with a laptop bag over one shoulder. Daniel Mercer, the man said. Seismic engineering. You said this couldn't wait. It can't. Daniel glanced at Annie, then at the chalk covering the wall. Where's the project engineer? Richard pointed toward the calculations. The person who prepared these figures is standing in front of you. Daniel looked at Annie's work shirt, then back at Richard. You brought me here to review calculations made by cleaning staff? Annie folded her arms. You can review the calculations without reviewing my uniform. Daniel's mouth tightened. I'm asking a professional question. No, she said. You're asking why someone dressed like me is standing beside numbers, you understand. Richard stepped between the argument before it grew further. Her employment position is not part of the calculation. Check the numbers. Daniel set his equipment case down. She isn't licensed. I know. She can't authorize structural work. No one is asking her to. You're here to determine whether the analysis is valid. Daniel looked toward the wall again. I'll need the original model. It was removed. The design database? Locked. Supporting reports? Most of them are gone. Daniel looked at Richard as if the request had become unreasonable. Then what exactly am I supposed to verify? Annie picked up one of the taped sheets. Start with the West core. The material grade listed in the summary doesn't match the installed beam stamps. Daniel accepted the page but did not look at it immediately. And you verified those stamps yourself? I recorded them during my shifts. You understand that copying project information without authorization creates a serious issue. So does approving calculations that don't match the material. Richard's phone rang before Daniel could answer. The second specialist had reached the security gate. Minutes later, Dr. Helen Park, a materials engineer, entered carrying a hard plastic case. Behind her came Thomas Reed, a structural engineer who had worked on several large public projects. Richard introduced them and explained the missing plans in as few words as possible. Thomas listened, then pointed toward Annie. She rebuilt the system? She reconstructed the critical structure, Richard said. From trash? From discarded drafts, field markings, and months of notes, Annie corrected. Thomas walked toward the nearest page. Careful, Annie said. The lower sheets aren't taped down. He stopped before placing his boot on them. You arranged this across a walkway. I arranged it in the only space with enough wall. Helen crouched beside the material schedule. Grade 65 listed here. Grade 50 inches your field notes. Yes. Do you have photographs? Annie unlocked her phone and opened a folder. Each image showed a beam identification stamp beside a date and location. Helen scrolled through several. These are clear. Daniel opened his laptop on the paint bucket. Clear photographs don't prove the design is wrong. No, Annie said. The load table does. Richard watched the three experts divide the work. Helen compared supplier codes and steel ratings. Thomas reviewed the transfer points between the towers. Daniel entered Annie's values into a simplified seismic model. At first, they spoke around her rather than to her. Thomas asked Richard where a connection figure came from. Annie answered. Daniel questioned an assumed damping ratio while looking at Samuel's empty name line on one of the sheets. Annie explained why she had used it. Helen asked whether the West Foundation value came from the final geotechnical report. I don't know, Annie said. I haven't seen the final report. Daniel looked up. Then your foundation conclusion may be incomplete. The conclusion is conditional, she replied. If the soil value is lower than the preliminary report, the west side needs further reinforcement. I marked that in the margin. Helen found the note. She did. Thomas turned toward Annie for the first time. Why didn't you assume the stronger value? Because I couldn't verify it. Most people would choose the figure that supports their design. I'm not trying to make the design look right. Richard heard the difference immediately. Annie was not defending her pride. She was defending the limits of what she knew. A cart rattled near the entrance. Maria Alvarez appeared carrying 2 cardboard trays of coffee and a paper bag from an all-night diner. She stopped when she saw the group. Mr. Whitmore, you started a technical review without breakfast? Richard checked the time. Maria, why are you here? I'm always here before the first crew. She handed him a cup. Black coffee. Unless becoming a billionaire changed that. It didn't. Maria offered the others coffee, then passed Annie a foil-wrapped breakfast burrito. Eat. I'm working. You can calculate and chew. Annie accepted it, opened the foil, then tore the burrito in half and wrapped one portion again. Maria noticed. Saving that for your mother? Annie nodded. Richard said nothing, but the small motion stayed with him. Maria turned toward the wall. So you finally made somebody look at it. Daniel glanced at her. You knew about this? I knew Annie had been checking the design. For how long? long enough for people with offices upstairs to ask why she kept reading their discarded pages. Richard shifted his attention to Maria. Did Charles know? He knew she asked questions. What did he do? Moved her cleaning assignment away from the design office for 2 weeks. Told the supervisors she was distracting the staff. Annie unwrapped her half of the burrito. I wasn't distracting anyone. They weren't listening. Maria gave Richard a direct look. Same result when the person in charge has already decided who deserves an answer. Richard's phone rang again. Charles Vance's name appeared on the screen. He answered on speaker. Richard, I'm told you brought outside engineers to the site. Charles said. You were told correctly. In the middle of the night, based on claims from a cleaner, Annie stopped eating. Richard's voice hardened. Her name is Annie Brooks. I know who she is. She has been collecting restricted documents and interfering with technical work for months. She identified a mismatch between your material schedule and the steel delivered to the West Core. That is not her field. It appears to be yours. Explain the mismatch. A pause followed. Charles answered more carefully. Preliminary schedules often differ from final procurement. Then why were the connection values altered to support both grades? You're drawing conclusions from incomplete records. Did you know grade 50 steel had been delivered? I'm not discussing technical details through a cleaning employee's handwritten notes. Annie set the food down. Ask him about revision 6. Richard looked at her. The West Tower value changed, she said. The central frame total didn't. Richard repeated the question. Charles replied, You are allowing panic to turn an unqualified worker into an authority. Richard watched Daniel's computer screen as the first model completed its run. The plotted movement exceeded the acceptable range at the central connection. Charles, Richard said, you keep telling me who she is. You haven't answered what she found. I advise you to end this before you embarrass the company. The call ended. No one spoke for several seconds because Daniel had begun the simulation again with the official values. The result remained the same. Thomas checked Annie's transfer calculations by hand. Helen confirmed that the lower grade steel could not support the assumptions listed in the summary without substantial revision. Daniel finally turned his laptop toward Richard. The original system has a major inconsistency. I need the full model before I can certify anything, but her central conclusion is valid. Richard looked at Annie. Thomas added, the revised arrangement on the wall is technically credible. It needs development, code review, and licensed approval. But it isn't guesswork. Helen closed the material file. And the steel discrepancy is real. Annie did not smile. What happens now? Richard expected her to ask about recognition or payment. Instead, she said, Are the morning crews still working from the old instructions? Maria answered. Not after I speak to them. Richard faced the wall again. Hours earlier, his company had lost its most important plans. Now 3 independent specialists were telling him the discarded replacement was more reliable than the official design. He turned to Annie. Help us finish the review. I need to go home. We have less than 9 hours. My mother expects me after every shift. I'll arrange a car. I take the bus. Then I'll have a car take you home and bring you back. Annie picked up the wrapped half of the burrito. You still think transportation solves the question? What question? Whether you want the work or whether you're willing to say who did it. Richard met her eyes. Come back in 2 hours, he said. When you do, your name will be on the review file. Annie gathered her calculator and her father's compass. I'll come back when I see it there. She walked toward the exit with Maria beside her. Richard remained near the concrete wall as the experts returned to the calculations. For the first time that morning, no one referred to Annie as the cleaner. They referred to her values, her model, and her design. Richard stayed at the site until Annie and Maria disappeared beyond the gate. Then he returned to the temporary office and called the Director of Human Resources. I need Annie Brooks's employment file. She works for a subcontractor. Then contact the subcontractor. Are we considering disciplinary action? No. I want her education history, any reports she submitted, and every communication involving Charles Vance. The director hesitated. That could take time. You have 30 minutes. Richard ended the call and opened the project portal. Most of Charles's files were inaccessible, but general employee reports remained on the system. A search for Annie's name produced 2 safety messages. The first concerned a connection ratio near the West Core. The second questioned the difference between the material schedule and numbers printed on delivered beams. Both reports had been closed without technical review. The response attached to each was identical. Facility staff advised to remain within assigned duties. Richard read the sentence twice. It sounded reasonable until he considered what it had prevented. Annie had provided enough information to justify an inspection. Instead of examining the figures, someone had reminded her of her position. His phone rang. The human resources director said, "We found an academic record." She attended 1 semester at Los Angeles City College through an architecture transfer program. Her grades were excellent. Why did she leave? The school lists non-payment. So she didn't fail? No. Any disciplinary reports at the site? 1. She was accused of entering the design office after hours. Was anything taken? Not according to the report. The evening supervisor confirmed she was completing her cleaning assignment. Who filed the complaint? Charles Vance's office. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. Send everything to my private account. Before leaving, he photographed Annie's work and asked the engineers to preserve every sheet. Thomas Reed agreed to remain at the site. Daniel Mercer continued building the seismic model, while Helen Park contacted the steel supplier. Maria was waiting near the gate. "You know where Annie learned this?" Richard asked. "Some of it. I need to speak to whoever trained her." Maria studied him. "Why?" "Because I'm trying to determine whether I can place the bid on her calculations." "No. You're trying to determine whether somebody with a title will give you permission to believe what you already saw." Richard accepted the criticism. Who trained her? Samuel Carter, retired structural engineer. He knew her father. Maria wrote an address on the back of a coffee receipt. "Don't walk into his house talking like you own the hour," she said. "Mr. Carter has little patience for important men arriving late to the truth." Samuel Carter lived in a modest Inglewood home with a narrow driveway and a garage converted into a workshop. When Richard arrived, the garage door was open. Samuel stood at an old drafting table, reviewing printed photographs Maria had already sent him. He did not offer Richard a seat. "You came about Annie. I need an independent assessment. You already brought in independent engineers. I need to know how she developed this level of understanding." Samuel removed his glasses. "Would the answer change the numbers?" "No." "Then why do you need it?" "Because I'm asking her to help complete a national bid. I need to know what I'm asking of her." Samuel considered that, then turned one photograph toward Richard. "This connection is her work. I recognize the method." "You taught her?" "I corrected her. There's a difference." Richard looked at the photograph. "She said she studied architecture." "She did. 1 semester in college and years on her own. She reads code manuals most professionals use as shelf decoration." "And her father?" "Daniel Brooks worked structural crews. He taught her measurement, balance, and how to question anything that didn't add up." Samuel's voice changed when he said Daniel's name. "He died in a workplace accident. He raised concerns before it happened, but the final report treated his warning like an inconvenience." Richard placed both hands on the drafting table. "Was it one of my sites?" "Not when it happened. Whitmore Global acquired the company later." "I didn't know." That sentence has protected a lot of powerful people. I'm not asking it to protect me. "Good, because not knowing doesn't repair anything." Richard looked toward a shelf filled with engineering books. Several carried handwritten notes along their spines. Samuel continued. "Annie remembers what happened to her father every time someone tells her to stay in her lane. She doesn't hear professional caution. She hears a warning being buried again. I'm willing to put her name on the review." "Willing?" Richard met his eyes. Samuel tapped the photograph. "Justice that arrives only after the powerful need something is not justice yet. It is an opportunity to begin." "What would make her come back?" "Ask her." Annie lived with her mother in a small apartment in Hyde Park. By the time Richard and Samuel arrived, Evelyn Brooks was standing in the kitchen in dark work pants, preparing oatmeal before her morning shift. Annie sat at the table with the wrapped half of Maria's breakfast burrito beside her. Evelyn opened the door but kept one hand on it. "Mr. Whitmore." "Yes, ma'am. This is Samuel Carter." "I know Samuel." She stepped aside. Richard waited until she invited him in. The apartment held what years of careful use left behind. Grocery coupons fixed to the refrigerator. Appointment cards under a magnet. A box fan near the window. And 2 coffee mugs that did not match. Richard remained standing. "I want Annie to return to Horizon 1. Annie did not look up from the table. "You said my name would be on the review." It will. That isn't the same as putting it in writing. I can pay you as a technical consultant. I can arrange transportation and discuss tuition support after the bid. Annie raised her head. You came here with money before you came here with terms. I'm trying to make this fair. No. You're trying to make it fast. We have hours left. You had months when I sent those reports. Richard felt Evelyn's attention move between them. He said, I didn't see them. You ran the company that closed them. I know. Annie's expression shifted slightly. She had expected an excuse. Richard continued, You were right. I need the design, but needing it doesn't give me the right to take it from you. He placed a document on the table. Annie did not touch it. What is that? A written agreement. Your calculations remain under your name. Every revision will carry a timestamp. Samuel will supervise the technical certification. You'll be paid for design work separately from your cleaning position. No one uses your image, your family, or your story without permission. Samuel picked up the pages and read them in full. And the bid? Annie asked. You will be listed as the originating structural design contributor, not the emergency team? Your name. What happens when the board objects? They can object to me. Annie looked toward Samuel. The language is clear, he said. It doesn't make you a licensed engineer, and it doesn't pretend that it does. It protects what you created, Richard added. The independent team will test every figure. If anything is wrong, they'll say so. That's what I want. Evelyn set a bowl of oatmeal in front of Annie. Eat before you decide. Mom, there isn't time. There is always time to avoid making an important decision hungry. Richard almost spoke, then chose not to. Annie took several bites while reading the agreement. She stopped at the final page. If I find another problem, I say it. Yes, even if it delays the bid. Richard waited before answering. Even then, and if someone tries to remove my name, I stop the submission. Evelyn looked at him. That promise will cost more than tuition if the moment comes. I understand. No, Annie said. You understand the words. We'll see whether you understand the cost. She signed the agreement. At 8:55 that morning, Annie returned to the Horizon 1 command center with Samuel and Richard. Her work clothes were clean, but faint chalk remained around her fingernails. She carried her calculator, composition books, and the brass compass. Inside the glass-walled design room, engineers and executives gathered around the central screen. Several turned when she entered. One man glanced at the facilities badge still attached to her shirt, then toward the coffee cups on the table. Richard opened the conference room door. Miss Brooks is here because she found what the rest of us missed. Annie stepped past him and placed her notebook beside the keyboard. The room made space, though not everyone did so willingly. She looked at the structural model on the screen. You entered the west connection incorrectly, she said. Move over. The engineer at the keyboard turned toward Annie. Excuse me? The west connection is entered as a fixed joint, she said. It needs limited movement along the north-south axis. Move over, and I'll show you. He looked at Richard. Mr. Whitmore, who exactly is directing this review? Samuel Carter is supervising the structural work, Richard said. Annie developed the corrective concept. Ask her about the model. The engineer remained seated. I'm Paul Dempsey, Senior Structural Coordinator. I don't surrender my workstation every time someone walks in with a notebook. Annie placed one of her calculations beside the keyboard. Then enter the correction yourself. Paul glanced at the page without touching it. Handwritten figures aren't a model. No, they're the reason your model keeps giving you the wrong result. A man entering behind them placed an empty coffee cup near Annie's elbow. Could you clear these before the board call? Annie looked at the cup, then at the man. Richard's voice cut across the exchange. Her name is Annie Brooks. She isn't here to clear your table. The man's face changed. I didn't realize. That's clear, Annie said. He took the cup and stepped away. A few people avoided looking in her direction. Others studied her facilities badge, as though it explained more than the calculations spread before her. Samuel set his briefcase on the table. Let's establish the process before we waste another minute. Annie is the originating design contributor. I am the supervising licensed engineer. Daniel Mercer, Thomas Reed, and Helen Park are providing independent review. Nothing leaves this office without certification. Paul pointed toward Annie's page. She has no degree, and no license. That is correct, Samuel said. Then she cannot approve structural changes. She is not approving them. She is presenting her design, and we are testing it. Paul looked toward Richard again. You're risking a national submission on an employee from the cleaning contractor. Annie opened her notebook. You're already risking it on a model entered incorrectly by a senior structural coordinator. Maria coughed into her hand, hiding a brief laugh. Paul turned back to the screen. What value do you want changed? First, remove the fixed condition at node W17. Then enter the rotational allowance from this table. He typed the figures. That increases movement. At one point. That weakens the frame. It prevents the towers from forcing their motion into the same central connection. Run the complete sequence. Paul started the simulation. Colored lines spread across the screen as the virtual towers shifted under the programmed ground motion. The west side moved farther than before, then settled as the dampers absorbed the force. The pressure on the central frame dropped. Paul studied the result. That could be temporary. Run the second earthquake record, Annie said. He did. The model produced another controlled response. A project executive named Grant Wallace folded his arms. Even if this works, we cannot rebuild an entire technical package around an untested proposal in one day. The proposal has been tested twice in front of you, Annie said. 2 simulations do not make a certified design. I never said they did. Then what are you claiming? That the original system uses the wrong material assumptions and transfers too much force into the central frame. The corrected approach gives your licensed engineers something safe enough to develop. Grant looked at Richard. This is exactly the credibility problem the board warned about. Richard kept his attention on Annie. Finish explaining the load path. Grant's voice sharpened. I'm speaking to you, and I'm listening. Richard replied. But you asked whether she understands the design. Let her answer. Annie stepped closer to the screen. Overlay the occupancy routes. Paul frowned. We're reviewing structure. Overlay them. Richard nodded once. Paul opened another layer. The hospital, residential towers, transit center, offices, and shared public areas appeared inside the structural frame. Annie pointed to the central podium. This corridor connects the medical wing to the emergency elevator core. Under the original design, the highest distortion forms here, Grant said. Emergency planning comes later, not when the escape route passes through the weakest section. The building code will address that during final development. The code sets a minimum. It doesn't know who will be using the corridor. Paul enlarged the floor plan. Annie continued. Think about someone recovering from surgery, a nurse moving equipment, an older resident who needs more time to reach a stairwell. You can't call the design safe if the structure survives, but the route people need becomes unusable. One of the remaining architects, Linda Shaw, studied the plan. She's right about the hospital connection. We placed the emergency route after the transfer frame was approved. Grant glanced at her. That issue is outside today's review. No, Linda said. It's connected to today's review. The exchange shifted the mood. The people around the table began examining the design rather than Annie's presence. Samuel handed Paul another page. Enter her revised damping distribution. Paul read the figures. These values depend on the East Tower mass estimate. Annie replied. The current estimate includes the roof equipment twice. That was corrected in revision 8. It was corrected in the architectural schedule, not in the structural model. Paul searched the file. After a moment, he found the duplicate entry. Linda whispered, How did no one catch that? Annie answered without looking at her. Everyone checked their own section. No one checked what happened when the sections met. Richard recognized the sentence as more than a technical criticism. His company had operated the same way. Each department protected its own work, while assuming someone else understood the full picture. Paul deleted the duplicate value and ran the program again. The revised structure performed better. A warning remained near the western foundation, but the central frame conflict had dropped below the previous range. Daniel Mercer moved beside the screen. The foundation alert cannot be resolved without the final soil report. Annie nodded. I marked it as conditional. You may need a larger pile group, or a lower transfer point if the deeper layer has the capacity shown in the preliminary study. Thomas Reed opened another file. I can request the geotechnical archive from the city. Grant checked his watch. We have less than 8 hours. Every request creates another delay. Annie faced him. Then submit the old design. He paused. She continued. Put your name on figures you already know are wrong. Explain to the review panel that speed mattered more than verification. No one is proposing that. That's what happens when every correction is treated as the problem. Richard looked at the countdown clock on the main display. 7 hours and 46 minutes remained. He addressed the entire group. We proceed with Annie's structural concept. Samuel supervises. Every critical calculation receives independent review. No assumptions are hidden to protect the deadline. Grant's expression tightened. The board may stop this. Then the board can explain its alternative. Annie opened another composition book. I need the original mechanical shaft dimensions, the updated hospital loads, and the West Side soil report. Linda moved toward a second workstation. I can get the shaft dimensions. Thomas reached for his phone. I'll handle the soil report. Paul placed a chair beside the keyboard. Show me the next connection. Annie sat, but she did not begin immediately. Change the author field. Paul looked at the corner of the screen. The file was still listed under Whitmore Global Emergency Design Team. He opened the document properties. What should it say? Annie Brooks. Originating structural design contributor. Paul typed the words. Annie checked the spelling, then pointed toward the next incorrect joint. Now move that support 12 inches east. The model began to change around her, one verified decision at a time. The room no longer questioned whether she could read the design. It was trying to keep pace with her. Paul shifted the support 12 inches east and reran the model. The warning at the central frame disappeared, but a new one appeared beside the mechanical shaft. That change creates a conflict here, he said. Annie studied the screen. Only because the shaft dimensions are still based on the old layout. Linda Shaw called from the next workstation. I'm opening the latest mechanical file now. Richard stood near the central table as the emergency team divided the work without waiting for another instruction. Thomas Reed requested the soil report from the city archive. Helen Park compared shipment records with the steel specifications. Daniel Mercer prepared a more detailed seismic simulation, while Samuel moved between the workstations, reviewing each calculation before allowing it into the updated file. Richard's phone continued to vibrate with calls from the board, investors, and legal counsel. He ignored the first two. On the third, he answered. Richard, the board needs an explanation, Grant Wallace said from across the table, speaking through the conference line as though he were not standing 20 feet away. They'll have one when we know the full extent of the problem. They want to know who is directing the redesign. Samuel is supervising it. That isn't what they're asking. Richard looked toward Annie. She was comparing the mechanical dimensions with the new support position while Paul adjusted the model. Annie Brooks developed the corrective concept, Richard said. Grant ended the call from his tablet and faced him. You keep saying her name as though repetition will make this normal. Richard lowered his phone. The design is improving. That makes it relevant. The company cannot build its national bid around someone without professional credentials. No one is asking the panel to ignore licensing requirements. Samuel and the independent engineers are certifying the work. That may satisfy a technical review. It won't satisfy public perception. Annie spoke without turning from the screen. Does public perception carry any weight in the structure? Grant's face tightened. This conversation concerns the future of the company. So does the math. Miss Brooks, you have been invited into a process you don't fully understand. Annie faced him. I understand that every time the design improves, you change the subject to my resume. Richard stepped in before Grant answered. We don't have time for this. Work the problem in front of us. Grant walked away, already typing another message. Paul enlarged the shaft area. Linda, I need the updated dimensions. They're coming. Coming when? When the file stops asking for a password Charles's office changed yesterday. Maria entered with 2 paper bags and a cardboard carrier filled with coffee. Then you'll work better after eating. No one ordered food, Grant said. I did, Maria replied. People make expensive mistakes when they skip breakfast. She placed foil-wrapped breakfast burritos, toast, fruit cups, and bottled orange juice on the side table. The smell brought several engineers away from their screens for the first time since the review began. Annie stayed at the workstation. Maria set a burrito beside her notebook. This is the second time I'm telling you to eat. I ate half of the first one. You saved half of the first one. That still counts. It counts as carrying food from one address to another. Annie opened the foil but continued reading the load table between bites. Paul accepted a coffee and leaned toward the screen. You were right about the mechanical file, Linda said. The shaft moved 8 inches in revision 7. But the structural model still uses revision 5. Paul corrected the dimension. Annie pointed to a vertical route running through the lower levels. Before you rerun it, add the maintenance access. That isn't structural, Paul said. It affects where the brace can go. We can relocate the access later. Later usually means someone has to work around a decision made by people who never use the space. Paul looked at the diagram. The access route is wider than required. It allows equipment to pass without removing the safety rail. That adds cost. It also means a maintenance worker doesn't have to dismantle part of the platform every time a pump needs replacing. Richard watched Paul consider the point before adjusting the brace. The change was small, but it reflected something the previous team had often ignored. Annie did not treat the building as a collection of impressive shapes. She considered the people who would repair it, clean it, move through it, and depend on it after the executives were gone. What about this corridor? Linda asked, indicating the medical section. The revised core reduces the width by 14 inches. Annie checked the plan. Move the storage wall instead. That affects the treatment floor. It affects a supply closet. The corridor needs the width more. Grant returned to the table. We are not redesigning interior space today. Annie looked at him. Then don't ask the structure to carry an interior plan that no longer fits. We need a bid package, not a perfect city. We need a design that doesn't create new problems every time we solve an old one. Richard said, move the storage wall. Mark it for later review. Grant gave him a hard look. Every change you approve adds another question the panel can ask. A question we can answer is better than a weakness we hide. The group returned to work. For the next 40 minutes, the screens filled with revised connections, load paths, and review notes. Annie moved between Paul's model and Samuel's calculations, correcting dimensions and refusing to approve any value she could not verify. Daniel started the full seismic sequence. The first run failed at the West Foundation. We still need the soil report, he said. Thomas checked his phone. The city archive found it. They're sending the file now. Annie used her father's brass compass to redraw the lower transfer arc on a sheet of tracing paper. The hinge caught halfway. Samuel noticed. I have a newer one in my case. This one works. It sticks. It still gives the right circle. Samuel said nothing more. Richard stood beside her. Why do you draw the force in curves? Because that's how I keep track of where it moves. You see the whole system that way? I see where each decision pushes the next one. He looked across the linked diagrams. Most people in this building only see their section. That's why the sections stop matching. Richard's phone vibrated again. This time, the message came from the public relations director. He opened the link. A headline filled the screen. Billionaire turns national infrastructure bid over to unlicensed night cleaner. A photograph of Annie's employee badge appeared beneath it. Richard's voice changed. Who released her name? The public relations director answered through the speaker. Not us. The story cites an unnamed senior source. Reporters are already outside headquarters. Remove the photograph. We don't control the outlet. Then contact them. That badge is an employment record. Grant looked at the headline. This is what I warned you about. Annie took out her phone. Messages were arriving faster than she could read them. Some questioned her education. Others accused her of participating in a publicity stunt. One message contained only 4 words. Go back to cleaning. She turned the screen face down. Richard noticed. You don't need to read any of that. They've already decided what I know without seeing a single number. We'll release the independent findings. No, Annie looked at him. Release the calculations. Don't turn me into a story before the work survives the review. Richard called the public relations director again. No interviews, no personal history, and no photographs of Annie. Issue 1 statement. The structural design is undergoing independent technical review. Nothing else. Grant shook his head. Silence will let Charles control the story. Richard looked at the model Annie had corrected. Then we give the truth something stronger than a press release. Thomas's computer sounded as the soil report arrived. He opened the file and read the confirmed value aloud. Daniel entered it into the simulation. The model began another run. Around them, Phones continued to ring, headlines continued to spread, and the countdown moved closer to the deadline. Annie picked up her pencil and returned to the West Foundation. The soil value is lower than the preliminary report, she said. We need to enlarge the pile group. Paul opened the connection table. How much? Annie placed her calculator beside the brass compass. Give me 5 minutes. Outside the design center, people were arguing about whether she deserved to be there. Inside, every person at the table waited for her answer. Annie entered the confirmed soil value, worked through the load distribution, and wrote 3 revised pile counts in the margin of her notebook. 28, she said. Paul glanced at the screen. The current group has 24. Add 4 and widen the cap by 18 inches. That pushes into the service trench. Shift the trench west. Linda opened the utility layer. That puts it against the emergency power line. Then split the pile group into 2 rows and rotate the lower brace. Paul began entering the changes. That's not 5 minutes of work. It took 4. Daniel ran the preliminary check. The warning near the West Foundation dropped, then disappeared. He looked from the screen to Annie's notebook. The distribution holds. Grant Wallace stepped closer. Does it hold under the full sequence? We're running that now, Daniel said. Grant checked the countdown. We have less than 6 hours. At some point, we need to stop redesigning and prepare the presentation. Annie closed the calculator cover. At some point, the design needs to be ready for one. Grant's phone rang. He looked at the caller, declined it, then faced Richard. The board wants you upstairs in 10 minutes. I'm not leaving this review. They're calling an emergency session. Then they can put me on a screen. They want to discuss the press coverage and Miss Brooks's involvement. Annie's phone vibrated again. This time, the caller was her mother. She moved toward the edge of the design area and answered. Hi, Mom. Evelyn's voice came through softly but clearly. A woman on the radio just said you're pretending to be an architect. I'm not pretending. I know that. I'm asking whether you're all right. Annie looked toward the workstations. Paul and Daniel were watching the simulation. Samuel was checking the revised foundation sheet. Richard was arguing with Grant near the conference screen. I'm working. That wasn't my question. Annie lowered her voice. People found my employee badge. They're posting it everywhere. Did the company release it? They say they didn't. And Mr. Whitmore? He told them not to use me for publicity. Evelyn paused. Is he keeping his word? So far. That means you keep watching. I am. A lie gets to speak first sometimes, Evelyn said. That doesn't mean it gets the last word. Annie closed her eyes for a moment. I need to go. Eat something. I did. More than half? Annie glanced at Maria. Maria raised one eyebrow. Yes, Annie said. That answer took too long. Despite everything moving around her, Annie smiled. I'll call when I can. She ended the call and returned to the table as the simulation completed. Daniel studied the results. The revised foundation passes the current parameters. Paul enlarged the central frame. Stress stays within range. Samuel checked the input list. Mark it provisional until the material verification is complete. Grant stepped in. Can we finally lock the structure? No, Annie said. His frustration showed. What now? The steel records. Helen is handling those, and she hasn't finished. We cannot wait for every invoice. We're not waiting for every invoice. We're waiting to confirm whether the material already installed matches the model we're about to submit. Grant turned to Richard. This is what happens when someone with no bid experience is allowed to control the schedule. Richard's answer came without delay. This is what happens when someone finally checks the work before signing it. Grant's face tightened. The board is asking whether you've lost perspective. Richard pointed toward the screen. That model performs better than the one Charles left us. The board is concerned about credibility. Then, they should be concerned about the people who removed the files. They're concerned about all of it. No, they're concerned about what Annie looks like in a headline. Grant lowered his voice. You are making this personal. It became personal when someone leaked her badge. Annie watched the exchange, then said, Don't defend me by pretending this is only about one leak. Richard turned toward her. She continued, The board doesn't need to insult me. They can call it optics, risk, or procedure. The result is the same if they use those words to remove me from the work. Grant said, No one is removing you. Then say my name will stay on the submission. He did not answer. Samuel set down his pen. That is a simple question. Grant looked toward the conference screen. Authorship is a board matter. No, Annie said. Authorship is a fact. Before Grant could respond, Helen Park entered carrying a printed shipment report. I found the supplier discrepancy. Everyone shifted toward her. Helen placed the report beside Annie's material notes. The beams marked grade 50 came through a company called Pacific Meridian Metals. Richard frowned. I don't know that name. You wouldn't. It was formed 11 months ago. Who approved it? Procurement lists a consultant recommendation from Vance Design Group. Grant picked up the report. That still doesn't prove misconduct. Helen opened a second page. The company has no manufacturing facility, no long-term supply record, and no direct steel certification under its own name. It appears to be a broker. Maria moved beside her. I photographed 3 of their trucks. You kept photographs? Richard asked. I keep records when deliveries arrive after midnight with labels that don't match the schedule. Why wasn't that reported? It was. The site office said procurement had approved the change. Richard's voice became quieter. Who signed the acceptance? Maria pointed to the bottom of the page. Charles Vance's authorization code appeared beneath the shipment number. A junior engineer named Marcus Lee rose from the far workstation. He had spoken little since Annie entered the room. There's something else, he said. Grant looked at him. What? Marcus held a portable drive. I saved a copy of the server access logs before the architecture team left. Richard turned toward him. Why? Because Charles ordered us to clear the revision history. He said it was part of the transition. Did you clear it? I did what he asked on the main server. Marcus swallowed. Then I copied the logs because it didn't feel right. Grant's expression changed. You removed company data. I preserved company data. You had no authorization. Marcus looked at Annie, then back at Grant. Neither did she when she found the flaw. That doesn't make the flaw disappear, Annie asked. What do the logs show? Charles's account accessed the material schedule 6 times after the final review. Each time, the steel grade field changed. Then the revision history was deleted. Richard extended his hand. Give me the drive. Grant stepped between them. Legal needs to take custody. Richard looked at him. Legal reports to the board. Yes. And right now, I don't know who on the board knew about this. Grant's voice dropped. Be careful what you're suggesting. I'm done being careful with the people who had authority. I'm going to be careful with the truth. Marcus placed the drive in Richard's hand. Annie studied the supplier code on Helen's report. Run the company registration through the state database. Helen opened her laptop. Already started. The result appeared seconds later. Pacific Meridian Metals was controlled by a holding company. That holding company shared an address with a consulting firm managed by Charles Vance's brother-in-law. No one needed to explain what the connection meant. Grant looked toward the boardroom screen, where an incoming call continued flashing. Richard declined it. Samuel gathered the reports into one stack. This is no longer a design dispute. Maria folded her arms. It stopped being one the moment someone made money from weaker steel. The countdown showed 5 hours and 12 minutes. Annie looked at the corrected model, the altered schedules, and the drive in Richard's hand. They didn't leave because the project was failing, she said. They left because they thought no one could rebuild it in time to find out why. Richard placed the portable drive beside Helen's laptop. Copy everything before anyone touches the original. Marcus nodded. I'll create 2 encrypted backups. One goes to outside counsel, Richard said. The other goes to the Federal Bid Compliance Office. Grant turned from the conference screen. You're sending internal records to the government before legal reviews them? I'm preserving evidence. You're exposing the company. Richard met his eyes. The company was exposed when someone altered structural records. I'm making sure no one gets the chance to erase that too. Helen opened the registration documents for Pacific Meridian Metals. The holding company behind it was called North Basin Consulting. Its listed office was a rented suite in Century City, the same address used by a firm managed by Charles Vance's brother-in-law. Maria moved closer. That supplier never made sense. Their trucks arrived with temporary placards, and the drivers wouldn't give us direct mill certificates. Who approved the deliveries on site? Richard asked. Charles's deputy signed the first 2. After that, the paperwork came marked as pre-approved. Helen scrolled through the payment records. The invoices were divided across 6 change orders. Each amount stayed below the level that would have triggered a full board review. Richard recognized 2 authorization codes. One was Charles's. The other was his own. He picked up the page. "I signed this," Grant answered quickly. "You signed a consolidated budget adjustment. You never saw the supplier detail. My signature released the money. That doesn't make you part of the scheme. It makes me responsible for asking why I didn't see it." Annie stood near the screen, comparing the dates on the invoices with the revision logs. The first material change happened before the 6th structural revision. Helen checked. By 11 days. "So the design wasn't changed and then followed by cheaper procurement," Annie said. "The cheaper material came first. They altered the calculations afterward to make it fit." Daniel looked at the sequence. "That means the structural adjustment was not an error." "It was cover," Samuel said. Grant rubbed his forehead. "We need proof that Charles knew the delivered grade before the revisions changed." Marcus inserted the copied drive into an isolated laptop. "The access logs may show that." He opened the recovered file history. Hundreds of entries appeared, each tied to a user account and timestamp. Annie leaned closer. "Filter by West Core, material schedule, and connection capacity." Marcus entered the terms. 6 records remained. The first showed Charles opening the delivery schedule. 12 minutes later, he accessed the connection tables. The next morning, a revised file appeared under another engineer's credentials. "Can a user ID be copied?" Richard asked. "Yes," Marcus said, "but the login came from Charles's office terminal, and the badge record shows him entering that floor at the same time." Grant's voice lost some of its confidence. "Still circumstantial." Maria placed her phone on the table. "Then add this." She opened photographs taken during 3 overnight deliveries. One image showed Charles standing beside a Pacific Meridian truck while a shipment was unloaded. Richard examined the date. "Why was he here at 1 in the morning?" "He told us the delivery was urgent and the day crew didn't need to be involved," Maria said. "Did he inspect the markings?" "He watched the first beam come off the truck. Then he signed the receipt." Helen matched the receipt number to the altered material schedule. Thomas Reed shook his head. He knew. Richard looked at the photograph for several seconds before setting the phone down. "Keep the original file. Send only a copy." Maria nodded. "Already did." The company's outside counsel joined by secure video. Richard summarized the evidence, then ordered the firm to begin a protected internal investigation and notify the appropriate bid authorities. The attorney said, "Once we disclose this, the government may suspend the submission." "They may suspend the entire company," Grant added. Richard answered, "Then they suspend it. We are not submitting a design while hiding procurement fraud." Annie looked at the countdown. "We still need to complete the corrected package." Grant faced her. "You heard what the attorney said. There may not be a bid. There still needs to be a safe design. For what purpose? For the workers already building it? For the review? For the record? Pick one." Samuel opened the latest calculation set. "She's right. The investigation and the technical work continue separately." Richard nodded. "No one stops the redesign." Helen began tracing payments from North Basin Consulting. Within minutes, she found transfers to a second company called Alder Crest Advisory. "That firm appears in the rival bidder's public disclosure," she said. Richard walked to her screen. "In what role?" "Strategic design consultant." Marcus searched the restored email archive. "I have calendar entries between Charles and Alder Crest." "How many?" 4 meetings in the last 3 weeks. Grant said, "Meeting with a consultant is not illegal." Marcus opened a deleted message fragment. This one might matter. The recovered text was incomplete, but several lines remained readable. "Whitmore will not have a compliant structural package by Tuesday. Corrected system will be ready for North Star submission." Richard read the message twice. "North Star Development is our main competitor." Helen continued down the thread. "There's an attachment reference, but the file is missing." "What was it called?" Annie asked. Helen enlarged the line. "Central, separation, concept, final." Annie stopped moving. Samuel noticed. "What is it?" "I used that phrase in a note I gave Charles." "When?" 3 months ago. I drew a small correction showing how the central structure could separate the tower movement. Richard looked toward her. You gave him a design concept? I gave him 1 page because I thought he might finally check the problem. Did you keep a copy? Annie opened her composition book and found a folded sheet taped inside the cover. The drawing was rougher than the current version, but the central separation pattern was clear. A date appeared at the top. Marcus compared it with the deleted email. Your note is 5 weeks earlier. Annie's voice stayed controlled, though her hand tightened around the page. He didn't ignore it. Samuel understood first. He took it. Annie nodded. He told me I didn't understand the project. Then he sent the idea to the company competing against us. Richard's anger changed direction. Until that moment, Charles's actions had been corporate betrayal. Now Richard saw the method beneath them. Charles had dismissed Annie publicly while using her work privately, certain that her job title would prevent anyone from believing her. Grant said, "We need to avoid calling this theft until the files are authenticated." Annie turned toward him. You keep finding careful words for what powerful people do. I'm protecting the legal case. Then protect it. Just don't ask me to pretend I don't understand what happened. Richard placed the dated sketch beside the recovered email. Her authorship goes into the evidence record. It could complicate the bid, Grant said. It already complicated her life. Maria's phone rang. She listened for a moment, then ended the call. 2 welders from the West section want to speak. About what? Richard asked. They noticed the replacement beams weighed less. Their supervisor told them the supplier had changed the manufacturing process. Bring them in, Grant objected. We cannot turn this office into an open hearing. Maria faced him. Those men have mortgages, medical coverage, and retirement accounts tied to this job. They reported something because they thought it mattered. Someone made sure it went nowhere. Richard said, "Let them speak." Within minutes, the workers arrived with copies of shift notes and text messages. Their records confirmed late deliveries, changed welding instructions, and repeated pressure to avoid written questions. One of them, a gray-haired ironworker named Frank, placed his notes on the table. I kept these because my father used to say a man's memory gets challenged when money enters the conversation. Richard read the first page. Why didn't this reach me? Frank gave him a tired look. Men like me don't reach men like you. We reach a supervisor, then a manager, then a form. Somewhere along the way, the warning becomes a complaint about attitude. Richard had no answer. Annie did. That's how they hid it, she said. They separated everyone who knew one part. The workers saw the material. I saw the numbers. Marcus saw the files. Maria saw the deliveries. They counted on us never being in the same place. Samuel gathered the evidence into a single sequence. Now you are. An alert appeared on Richard's phone. Charles's attorneys had filed a formal complaint, accusing Annie of stealing proprietary design information and Whitmore Global of using it in the national bid. Grant read the notice over Richard's shoulder. They're demanding her notes, her phone records, and immediate removal from the project. Annie looked at the recovered email, her dated sketch, and the altered material files. He's not trying to escape the truth, she said. He thinks he can arrive first and put his name on it. The board's emergency call began before Richard had finished reading Charles's complaint. 12 faces appeared across the conference screen, most of them speaking from offices far removed from the construction site. Eleanor Price, chair of the board, went first. Richard, we need Annie Brooks removed from the technical team until legal determines whether her notes contain proprietary material. Richard remained beside the evidence table. Her notes predate the files Charles sent to Northstar. That has not been authenticated. Samuel has verified the dates. Marcus recovered the server history. And Charles has filed a formal claim against her. Charles also approved inferior steel and transferred design information to a competitor. Eleanor's expression did not change. Allegations are not findings. Annie stood at the nearest workstation with Samuel. She continued checking the structural package, though every word carried across the room. Another board member, Howard Bell, said, "We are losing control of the narrative. The public sees a national project being redesigned by a cleaning employee with no degree. She has a name," Richard said. "We know her name. That is part of the problem." Annie stopped writing. Richard's voice sharpened. Explain that. Howard adjusted his glasses. The panel will question why Whitmore Global depended on someone outside the professional chain of command. They may conclude our entire engineering process is unreliable. Our engineering process was unreliable. She found the proof. That is not how we present it. Richard looked at the countdown clock. 4 hours and 37 minutes remained. How do you suggest we present it? Eleanor answered. Samuel Carter signs the corrected design as supervising engineer. The remaining technical staff receives collective credit. Miss Brooks is compensated through a confidential consulting agreement. Samuel closed the folder in front of him. No. Eleanor looked toward his image on the room camera. Mr. Carter, you would receive full authority to certify the package. I already have the authority to certify what I review. I do not have the authority to erase who created it. This is not erasure. It is professional attribution. Annie stepped away from the workstation. Professional attribution to everyone except me. Grant Wallace moved closer to the screen. Annie, let Richard handle this. I am being discussed. I'll handle my part. Eleanor said. Miss Brooks, no one is denying your contribution. You're proposing a document that does exactly that. We are protecting the bid. From what? Howard answered. From questions about qualification. My qualifications didn't stop you from using my calculations. This is not personal. Annie gave a restrained laugh. That sentence usually appears right before someone takes something personal. Richard raised a hand. Enough. Her name stays on the review file. The review file can remain internal, Eleanor said. The public submission should identify the work as a Whitmore Global emergency redesign. Annie looked at Richard. Is that what you want? He did not answer immediately. The hesitation lasted only a few seconds, but everyone noticed it. Richard walked toward the table and placed both hands beside the recovered records. I want the project to survive the day. That wasn't my question. Annie, thousands of jobs depend on this submission. If the panel rejects the package before reviewing the numbers, none of this work matters. So hide my name until you get what you need? I said nothing about hiding it permanently. When would you add it back? After the technical review, after we stabilize the bid, and after everyone has already been told the design came from your team. Richard's voice lowered. We may need to separate the work from the story for one day. Annie looked at him for several seconds. Which part am I, Mr. Whitmore? The work or the story? Richard had no answer that would not make the situation worse. Eleanor spoke through the screen. Miss Brooks, this company is offering you compensation and future educational support. Most people in your position would recognize the opportunity. My position? Your current professional position. You mean the position that made it easy to ignore me? Grant said. No one is insulting you. You don't have to insult me. You can call it procedure and reach the same result. Richard stepped toward her. I am trying to protect your future. You cannot protect my future by erasing me from the reason it exists. Her voice carried more force than volume. Around the table, no one reached for a phone or interrupted. Richard said, the board can destroy this bid before we reach the hearing. Then let them explain why. You think that helps the crews outside? The suppliers? The people waiting for these jobs? Don't use them to make theft sound responsible. That is not fair. No. Fair would have been reading my reports when I submitted them. Fair would have been testing my calculations before Charles used one of my ideas. Fair would be leaving my name where the truth put it. Samuel faced the conference screen. A licensed signature can certify the numbers. It cannot certify a lie about who produced them, Howard said. Mr. Carter, your emotional connection to Miss Brooks may be affecting your judgment. My judgment is why you asked me here. Eleanor took control again. The board authorizes removal of individual attribution from the public package. Legal will prepare a separate agreement for Miss Brooks. Annie turned to Richard. Will you stop them? He looked at the screen, the deadline, and the worker's statement spread across the table. Every choice carried a cost. And for one final moment, he tried to find a way to delay paying it. We need to get the bid through review first, he said. Annie nodded once, as though a question had finally been answered. She removed the temporary technical badge from her work shirt and placed it beside the keyboard. Then she lifted her father's brass compass from the table and slipped it into her pocket. Richard took a step toward her. Annie, wait. You brought me into this room because you needed what was in my head. I thought you had started to see the person carrying it. I do. Then you should have spoken before they finished the sentence. She gathered her composition books. Paul stood from his workstation. The model isn't complete. The calculations you have are verified through the West Core. Samuel knows what still needs review. We need you here. Annie looked at him. Needing me and respecting me are not the same thing. She walked toward the conference room door. On the central screen, a technician opened the document properties and replaced Annie's contributor line with Whitmore Global Emergency Design Team. Richard saw the words change. Stop, he said. The technician froze. Richard looked toward the board members on the screen. Put her name back. Eleanor replied. The board has made its decision. Richard's attention shifted to the doorway, but Annie was already gone. On the table, the abandoned badge sat beneath the white light, while her design continued running on every screen in the room. Annie reached the service elevator before the security light above the doors changed from green to red. She pressed the button again, but the panel displayed access revoked. Two security officers approached from the main desk. The older one, Raymond Cole, had greeted her at the employee entrance many nights. He held a tablet against his chest and seemed uncomfortable meeting her eyes. Annie, we need you to come with us. For what? We received instructions from corporate risk. I'm leaving already. They want the temporary badge and any company material in your possession. Annie touched the pocket holding her father's compass. My notebooks are mine. Raymond nodded. No one said otherwise. The second officer, a younger woman named Claire, gestured toward the security desk. We only need to document what was issued by Whitmore Global. Annie looked through the glass wall toward the design center. Her structural model remained open on the largest screen. Paul and Daniel were still working from her calculations, while the author field now carried the company's name. You deactivated my badge before I left the floor. Raymond lowered the tablet. The order came from the board's risk committee. Of course it did. At the desk, Claire placed a cardboard records box on the counter. Inside were Annie's cleaning gloves, lunch container, spare shirt, pencils, and the calculator she had used during her regular shifts. Someone had already emptied her locker. Annie lifted the calculator. Who gave you permission to pack my things? The facilities contractor cleared the locker after your access changed, Claire said. My shift isn't over until tonight. They suspended your assignment. Annie looked at Raymond. So I find a defect, rebuild the plan, and before the day is over, I lose both jobs. I don't make those decisions. No, you just carry them out. Raymond accepted the words without defending himself. I'm sorry. A woman in a dark suit entered through the security gate and introduced herself as Dana Fowler from the company's compliance office. She placed a written notice on the counter. Miss Brooks, Charles Vance's attorneys allege that you copied protected design material and accessed information outside your assigned duties. We need to ask you several questions. You can ask. We would also like your phone and notebooks for review. No. Dana kept her voice measured. Refusing may delay the investigation. My phone has my mother's information, my school records, and photographs I took on my own time. My notebooks were purchased with my money. If they contain project data, they may be relevant. Then send a written request to Samuel Carter. I'm not handing you everything I have because Charles filed a complaint. Samuel arrived before Dana could respond. He walked directly to Annie's side. She will answer reasonable questions, he said. She will not surrender personal property without a clear legal process. Dana recognized him. Mr. Carter, this is an internal review. Then conduct it like one. Ask what you need. Record her answers. Do not treat an accusation as a verdict. Maria crossed the lobby a moment later, moving faster than Richard had ever seen her move. What are you doing with her things? Claire explained that Annie's access had been revoked. Maria looked into the box. You packed her lunch and gloves before anyone even finished checking Charles's complaint? We're following written instructions, Raymond said. Maria pointed toward the papers in Dana's hand. Paper can tell you what you're allowed to do. It can't tell you whether you should be ashamed of doing it. Dana ignored the remark and turned to Annie. Did you remove drawings from the design office? I recovered pages that had been discarded. Did you photograph project materials? Yes. Did anyone authorize those photographs? No. Did you share them outside the company? Only with Samuel after Richard asked him to review my calculations. Did you attempt to sell the information? No. Did you contact North Star Development? No. Did you provide Charles Vance with a structural concept? I showed him one page 3 months ago because I thought he would check the design. Dana entered the answer on her tablet. Do you have proof of the date? It's in my notebook. Then allowing us to copy the page would support your statement. Samuel looked at Annie. A single supervised copy, nothing else. Annie removed the folded sketch and placed it on the counter. Dana photographed the date, the drawing, and Annie's handwritten notes before returning it. The service elevator opened behind them. Richard came out alone. His attention moved from Samuel to Maria, then to the cardboard box on the counter. What is that? Miss Brooks's personal property, Dana said. Why was it removed from her locker? Her site access has been suspended. Restore it. Dana held his gaze. You no longer have authority to do that. Richard's expression changed. What did you say? Eleanor Price's voice came through his phone before Dana could answer. The call had already connected. The board voted to suspend you as chief executive pending review, Eleanor said. The notice was delivered electronically. Richard looked at the screen, then at Annie. On what grounds? Unauthorized commitments, mishandling of confidential material, and actions that may expose the company to liability. I founded this company. You remain a shareholder and board member. You do not retain operational control during the investigation. Richard ended the call. Annie lifted the cardboard box. Now you know how quickly a title disappears when someone else controls the door. He stepped toward her. I put your name back on the file. After I left. I should have done it sooner. Yes. The board won't submit the design without your credit. They just removed both of us. What you intend doesn't change what they can do. Richard turned to Dana. Is the submission proceeding? That decision now rests with the interim executive committee. And they plan to use her work? Dana did not answer. Richard took out his phone and called Grant. The call went to voicemail. He tried Eleanor next. She answered. If the board submits Annie's design without her name, I will challenge the filing publicly. You are suspended, Richard. I still own enough of this company to prevent you from pretending theft is governance. You are making a serious mistake. No. I made the mistake when I stayed quiet in that meeting. He ended the call and faced Annie. Come back upstairs with me. My badge doesn't work. I'll walk you in. And then what? You don't control the floor anymore. Richard had spent his adult life solving problems through authority. For the first time, he had none he could use. Annie shifted the box in her arms. I gave you the calculations through the West Core. Samuel knows what remains unverified. I'm finished. We have less than 4 hours. You still have engineers. We don't have you. She looked at him. You had me when it mattered. Annie walked through the exit with Samuel and Maria. Richard followed as far as the gate, but he did not call after her again. Rain had begun outside. Near the curb, he noticed her cleaning company badge lying face up in a shallow stream of water. The printed letters of her name had started to blur. He picked it up and returned to the lobby. Through the glass, he could see the corrected structure rotating across the main display. Annie's work filled the screen, but Annie had been removed from the building. Richard called Eleanor one final time. If that package leaves under another name, I will disclose every record we found today. You would destroy the bid. I would stop the company from using theft to save it. You can be replaced. Richard looked at the wet badge in his hand. You can replace my title, he said. You cannot make theft become leadership. Richard left Horizon 1 with Annie's wet badge in his coat pocket and the withdrawal letter open on his phone. The board had already assigned Grant Wallace temporary control of the submission. Richard still held enough ownership to challenge the filing, but not enough time to win an internal fight before the deadline. He called Annie twice. Both calls went unanswered. His next call was to Samuel. Is she with you? No. She left before Maria and I reached the parking lot. Where would she go? Home, maybe. Give her time. We have less than 3 hours. Samuel's voice hardened. The deadline is not her responsibility anymore. I know. Do you? Richard looked at Horizon 1 through the windshield. I'm withdrawing the bid if they submit her work without her name. Samuel did not answer at once. Come to Annie's apartment. I'll meet you there. Richard drove to Hyde Park without an assistant, security detail, or company car. Rain followed him along the freeway and slowed traffic near downtown. By the time he reached the apartment building, Samuel was waiting near the entrance. Evelyn opened the door in her work clothes, one hand still holding the strap of her bag. "She isn't here," she said before Richard could speak. "Did she come home?" "For 5 minutes. She took her father's notebook and left." "Did she say where she was going?" Evelyn studied him. "Why should I tell you?" Richard removed Annie's badge from his pocket. The ink had smeared across the plastic. This was outside the building. Evelyn looked at the damaged badge but did not take it. "You found her work under your city," she said. "Your company took the work, removed her name, and sent her home with a box. I tried to stop them. You waited until she walked out." Richard lowered his hand. "Yes." The answer changed Evelyn's expression, though not enough to soften it. Samuel asked, "Did she take Daniel's brass compass?" "She already had it. She came back for the black notebook." Samuel nodded. "I know where she may be." They drove south to an empty industrial property near the edge of Vernon. Most of the former structure had been removed. A section of concrete retaining wall remained beside a fenced lot, marked by faded survey paint and old bolt holes. Annie sat on a low concrete block with the black notebook open across her knees. Her cardboard box rested beside her. She did not rise when Richard approached. "You brought everyone," she said. Evelyn stopped several feet away. "Samuel called me." "I'm fine, Mom." "I didn't ask whether you were fine." Richard remained where Annie could see him without having to turn. "I came to apologize." "You already apologized." "I said I should have acted sooner. That wasn't enough." Annie closed the notebook. "What do you want?" "For you to hear the truth before you decide what happens next." "I heard the truth in the board meeting." "You heard me fail to speak when I should have." "That was clear enough." Richard took the withdrawal letter from his coat and held it out. Annie did not reach for it, so he placed it on the concrete between them. "I prepared this after you left. If the board refuses to list your contribution, Horizon 1 will withdraw from the national bid." Annie glanced at the first page. "You expect me to believe you'll lose billions over a name?" "No. I expect you to believe I'll lose billions rather than submit stolen work." "You didn't believe that an hour ago." "You're right." Samuel stood beside Evelyn, allowing Richard to continue without helping him. Richard said, "In that meeting, I told myself I was protecting the project. I thought the board could restore your credit after the submission. I told myself thousands of jobs mattered more than one contributor line. And now? Now I understand that the project became dishonest the moment we decided your name was negotiable." Annie rose, holding the notebook against her side. "You understood when it started costing you." "Yes." The admission stopped the next accusation before she spoke it. Richard continued. "Justice that appears only when a powerful man needs something isn't justice. Samuel told me that this morning. I thought I understood him. I didn't." Annie looked toward Samuel. He gave no sign that Richard deserved help. Richard said, "I don't expect gratitude. I expect consequences. If the bid is lost, I accept that. If the board removes me permanently, I accept that too. And if I return, you get the design. If you return, the public gets the truth. The design still has to pass every review." "You make that sound noble." "It isn't. It is what I should have done before you left." Evelyn stepped closer to Annie. "What do you want?" "I want to go home." "That is what you want for the next hour. I'm asking what you want after that." Annie looked at the wall behind her. "I don't want my face in their advertisements. I don't want Richard standing beside me while reporters write that he discovered me. I was working before he arrived." Richard nodded. "Agreed. I don't want a check offered in exchange for silence." "Agreed. I present the design myself." "Yes. My name stays on every official record that uses my calculations." "Yes." Samuel supervises the certification. The independent engineers review everything. No shortcuts, because the clock is running. "Yes. If I find another flaw, we disclose it even if it ends the bid." Richard answered without hesitation. "Yes." Annie watched him closely. "And you tell the panel what happened in that meeting?" "I will. Not a cleaned-up version. The board proposed removing your name." I hesitated. "Then I agreed that the submission came first." "I'll say it exactly that way." Evelyn turned to her daughter. "You do not have to return for him." "I know. You don't have to rescue his company." "I know." Samuel spoke for the first time since they arrived. "The company has not earned your rescue." The people who may one day work, recover, or sleep inside those buildings have earned an honest design. Annie's hand moved over the edge of her father's notebook. What if they remove me again? Evelyn answered. Then make sure the door closes loudly enough for the entire country to hear it. Richard said, I won't promise that no one will come after you. I no longer have the right to make promises about what other people will do. I can promise where I'll stand when they do it. Where? In front of the record, with my name beside the failure. Annie read the withdrawal letter. Richard had already signed it. A timestamp at the bottom showed it had been prepared before he found her. She folded it once and handed it back. Keep this ready. Does that mean you're returning? It means you follow my conditions until the submission is accepted. If you break one, you file that letter. Richard placed it inside his coat. Understood. They returned to his pickup. Maria waited near the road in her own truck, having followed Samuel's directions. When she saw Annie carrying the cardboard box, she opened the rear door and took it from her. No one puts your work tools in a records box again, Maria said. Annie climbed into the front passenger seat. Samuel and Evelyn sat behind them. She placed the brass compass on the dashboard, then checked the time. 43 minutes remained before the submission deadline. Richard started the engine. Don't drive like a billionaire, Annie said. He glanced at her. What does that mean? Like the road was built for you alone. Maria laughed from the open window of her truck. Richard pulled into traffic, waited for the next car to pass, and followed it toward downtown. Traffic slowed near downtown, forcing Richard to watch the dashboard clock lose another minute. Annie kept the tablet on her knees, while Samuel reviewed the final calculations from the back seat. Evelyn sat beside him, holding Annie's cardboard box so it would not slide whenever the truck stopped. Maria followed in her own vehicle with the verified field records. Richard's phone connected to Paul at Horizon 1. We've completed the West Core update, Paul said. Daniel signed the seismic review, and Helen attached the steel report. What's still open? Annie asked. The hospital load table. Linda found 2 values that don't match. Which floor? 14. Annie opened the latest drawing. The rehabilitation equipment was entered twice. Remove the temporary estimate, but keep the permanent load. Paul worked through the change. That clears it. Don't close the section yet. Have Samuel check the revised total. Richard glanced at the clock. 32 minutes. Annie continued reading. A deadline doesn't certify a number. Samuel took the tablet from her, reviewed the table, and returned it. The correction is valid. Mark it verified under my license. Paul updated the document. We're assembling the final package now. Grant's voice entered the call. Not under Richard's authority. Richard's hands tightened around the steering wheel. Grant, restore Annie's contributor line and submit the package. The interim committee has approved the company attribution. Then the interim committee can explain why it is filing work under a false record. We are not having this argument again. Annie leaned toward the phone. You aren't having an argument. You're being given the conditions under which my work can be used. Grant paused. Miss Brooks, the board's position has not changed. Neither has mine. Richard said, I have a signed withdrawal letter. If her name is removed, I file it before the deadline. You would sacrifice the contract over one line? No. I would sacrifice it rather than make that line a lie. Grant disconnected. For several seconds, only the windshield wipers and passing traffic filled the truck. Evelyn looked at Richard. He thinks you'll change your mind. He has years of evidence supporting that belief. Annie checked the contributor page on the shared tablet. Her name had not been restored. 27 minutes, she said. Richard called Eleanor Price. She answered after the 4th ring. You're making the company impossible to govern, she said. I'm asking the company to identify the person who created the design. The licensed engineers certify it. Certification and authorship are different facts. You are allowing guilt to control a national project. I allowed convenience to control it before. That is why we're here. Eleanor lowered her voice. Richard, withdraw this threat. We can recognize Annie after the bid is secured. Annie heard every word. Richard answered. That is the same proposal, only spoken more gently. The board will hold you personally responsible if the contract is lost. Put that in the minutes, then restore her name. He ended the call. Annie watched the document on the tablet. Nothing changed. At the next intersection, Traffic stopped entirely. A delivery truck blocked one lane while a city bus attempted to turn through the remaining space. Richard checked the side mirror, considering the shoulder. "Don't," Annie said. "We have 23 minutes. And a traffic law. I can reach the next street from the service lane. You promised not to drive as if the road was yours." Samuel spoke from behind them. "She has a strong memory when a promise is recent." Richard remained in his lane. Maria called through the truck's audio system. "I know another entrance to the convention center. Follow me after the next light." When traffic moved, Maria passed them and guided Richard through two side streets toward the loading entrance. They reached the convention center with 17 minutes remaining. Security stopped them at the underground gate. Richard presented his identification. The guard scanned it and shook his head. "Your corporate access has been suspended. I'm here for the National Infrastructure hearing. You're listed as an attendee, not an authorized submitting officer." Samuel handed the guard his engineering license and the cover page of the technical review. "I am the supervising engineer of record. These documents must reach the submission desk before 5. The guard examined the papers, then called a supervisor. Richard looked at the clock above the gate. 14 minutes remained. Annie opened the package again. "The author field still hasn't changed," Evelyn asked. "Can they submit without it?" "They can try." Richard removed the signed withdrawal notice from his coat. "Then this goes in first." The gate supervisor arrived and allowed Samuel, Annie, and Richard to enter after verifying the hearing registration. Maria and Evelyn were directed toward the public entrance. Evelyn handed Annie the cardboard box. "Leave it with me," Annie said. "You don't need cleaning gloves at a technical hearing. They're mine." Evelyn understood and took the box back. Then she adjusted the collar of Annie's work shirt. "Speak slowly," she said. "Let them work to keep up with you." Annie nodded and followed Richard inside. They reached the submission area with 9 minutes remaining. Paul, Linda, Daniel, Helen, and Marcus were already connected through a video call displayed on Samuel's tablet. Paul said, "The package is complete, but the board locked the contributor field." "Can you unlock it?" Annie asked. "Not from my account." Marcus spoke next. "I preserved the earlier version with your name and the complete time history. I can attach it as an independent authorship record." "Do it," Samuel said. A submission clerk raised one hand. "All supporting documents must be included before the primary package is filed. No amendments after 5. Richard placed the withdrawal notice on the counter. "If the authorship record is rejected, process this instead." The clerk read the first lines. "You are withdrawing Horizon 1? Only if the technical package identifies the design incorrectly." Samuel attached his certification. Daniel and Thomas added their digital seals. Helen uploaded the materials report. Maria sent the field photographs from the public lobby, and Marcus added the recovered server history. Annie reviewed the contributor page one final time. The locked company field remained, but beneath it appeared a signed supplemental statement. "Originating structural design contributor, Annie Brooks. Work developed independently and verified under the supervision of Samuel Carter, P.E." Annie read every word. "Is that accurate?" Richard asked. "Yes." "Is it enough?" "It tells the truth." The countdown reached 3 minutes. The clerk reviewed the file list. "Your disclosure statement admits possible procurement fraud and unresolved corporate control." Richard said, "Correct. That may trigger an automatic compliance review." "It should." She looked at him with brief surprise, then returned to the screen. "Once submitted, the package cannot be removed without a formal request." Richard looked at Annie. She said, "Submit it." At 4:58 p.m., the clerk pressed the final authorization key. A confirmation number appeared on the monitor. No one celebrated. They had not won the contract, cleared the company, or completed the design. They had only placed an honest record before people who could test it. Samuel checked the receipt and slipped it into his folder. "Now we prepare for the hearing." Annie looked down at her work shirt. "I'm presenting like this." "You can," Samuel said, "but I have something in the car." He returned several minutes later, carrying a navy blazer. "This was my wife's. She taught mathematics for 31 years and never tolerated anyone confusing confidence with competence." Annie ran her fingers over the sleeve. "Are you sure?" She would ask whether you intend to use it well. "I do." In the restroom, Annie washed the remaining chalk from her hands but left a faint white line near one cuff. She put on the blazer over her work shirt and returned to the lobby. Evelyn was waiting with Maria. Richard's attorneys approached him near the hearing entrance. "Do not admit the board attempted to remove her name," one lawyer said. "Limit your statement to technical and procurement issues." Richard looked toward Annie. She was standing beside the submission desk with her father's brass compass in one hand. "A defense that requires pretending we didn't fail her is another failure," he said. At 6 o'clock, the hearing doors opened. Charles Vance entered with North Star Development's legal and technical team. His presentation materials were prepared, printed, and arranged in matching binders. He noticed Annie's work shirt beneath Samuel's navy blazer and smiled. Charles walked toward the stage carrying a polished presentation. Annie walked toward a blank whiteboard carrying a piece of chalk. Charles Vance reached the presentation table first. He placed both hands on either side of a thick binder and waited until the review panel finished confirming the attendance list. At the center sat Dr. Rebecca Sloan, a federal structural engineer with 30 years of public infrastructure experience. To her right were representatives from transportation, housing, emergency planning, and procurement oversight. Every statement was being recorded. Dr. Sloan looked toward Charles. "Mr. Vance, North Star Development requested permission to challenge the technical validity and authorship of Whitmore Global's revised submission. You may proceed." Charles thanked her and activated the main screen. Horizon 1 was developed under my direction for more than 6 months. Yesterday, after serious disagreements regarding leadership and professional standards, my team ended its relationship with Whitmore Global. Richard sat beside Samuel at the opposite table. Annie stood near the whiteboard, waiting. Charles continued. "Within hours, Whitmore submitted a replacement structural concept allegedly developed by a member of its overnight cleaning staff. She has no degree, no professional license, and no documented design experience." Annie's hand tightened around the chalk, but she did not interrupt. Charles displayed a photograph of the concrete wall. "This is not an approved drafting process. It is an unsupervised reconstruction based on confidential material removed from design office waste containers." Dr. Sloan asked, "Are you claiming Miss Brooks copied your completed design?" "I am saying she had access to fragments of it and lacks the education required to understand what she used." Samuel wrote something on a legal pad and slid it toward Richard. "He attacks her resume because he cannot defend the numbers." Charles presented several pages from the original design, then displayed the central separation concept. "The so-called correction is derived from work already created by my office. Whitmore Global has turned an internal security breach into a public relations performance." Dr. Sloan looked toward Richard. "Mr. Whitmore, do you wish to respond?" Richard rose. His attorneys sat 2 rows behind him. One shook his head, reminding him of their warning. Richard walked to the microphone anyway. "Charles is correct about one thing. Whitmore Global's design process failed." Charles's expression shifted. Richard continued. "The original structural package contained inconsistent material values and an unresolved load transfer conflict. Those issues were not identified by our senior leadership. They were identified by Annie Brooks." A panel member asked, "When did your company first receive her warning?" "Months ago. She submitted 2 reports through our employee system. And what happened to them? They were closed without technical review because she worked for the facilities contractor." Dr. Sloan looked down at the submission record. "Did the board later attempt to remove Miss Brooks's name from the revised package?" "Yes." A murmur moved through the audience. Richard did not turn toward it. "The board proposed listing the work under a general emergency design team. I hesitated before opposing that decision. I told myself the bid, the workforce, and the future of the company had to come first." Annie watched him without expression. Richard said, "That was another failure. A company cannot claim to protect integrity while taking credit from the person who restored it." Charles stepped toward his microphone. "This confession does not make her qualified." "No," Richard said. "Her work must do that." He faced the panel. "The greatest risk in Horizon 1 was not an earthquake. It was the arrogance of powerful people who believed intelligence could not wear a cleaning uniform." Dr. Sloan turned toward Annie. "Miss Brooks, are you prepared to explain the revised concept?" "Yes. You understand that this panel will evaluate the work by professional standards. Your circumstances will not change that standard." "That's what I'm asking for." Annie walked to the whiteboard. "My name is Annie Brooks. I am not a licensed architect or engineer. I developed the original corrective concept, and the calculations were reviewed under the supervision of Samuel Carter and 3 independent specialists. She drew 2 vertical lines representing the towers and a smaller structure connecting them. The original model assumes these towers respond independently during seismic movement. They don't. They have different mass, different height, and different response periods. She drew arrows in opposite directions. When one tower moves, the shared central frame receives force before the second tower completes its response. The original connection traps that force here. She marked the transfer level. Dr. Sloan asked, "What is the result?" "Excessive rotational demand at the central connection and increased stress at the west core," Charles interrupted. "That explanation is taken directly from my team's early analysis." Annie turned toward him. "Your final model still treats node W17 as fixed. That was a preliminary condition. It remained in revision 8. Charles opened his binder. "The full system compensates for it. Then show the panel where." Charles looked toward the screen operator. "The detailed model is proprietary." Dr. Sloan said, "You challenged the revised submission. The technical basis of that challenge is now relevant." Charles adjusted his cuff. "The model is controlled by North Star's legal agreement." Annie faced the board again. "I can show the conflict without his file." She wrote the original values on the board and explained how the towers transferred force into the shared structure. Then she replaced the fixed connection with controlled movement and redistributed the dampers. A panel engineer named Michael Harris approached the microphone. "Your revised West Foundation assumes a verified soil capacity of 14,000 pounds per square foot. 12,800, Annie corrected. Harris checked the package. "The summary page says 14. The summary page uses the preliminary report. The revised calculation in Appendix C uses the final value." Samuel opened the appendix and handed it to the clerk. Harris reviewed it. "You enlarged the pile group from 24 to 28. That creates a conflict with the service trench. We divided the group into 2 rows and rotated the lower brace, which moves the brace near the emergency power route. The power route was relocated 18 inches west after the maintenance clearance review." Harris looked through the drawings, then nodded. "It's documented." Another engineer entered a new set of figures into the panel system. "We're changing the east tower mass by 4%. Recalculate the central transfer demand." Annie studied the values, used her handheld calculator, and wrote the equation on the board. Halfway through, she stopped. "The third value should be multiplied by 0.96, not 0.94. She erased 2 digits and continued. Charles smiled. "She has already made an error." Annie kept calculating. "I corrected an entry before using it. That's what review is for." A few minutes later, she placed the result beneath the equation. The engineer compared it with the panel's software. "The difference is less than 1%, he said. Dr. Sloan asked, "Would you consider this design ready for construction?" "No." Charles spread his hands. "There it is," Annie continued before he could say more. "It is ready for bid-level technical review. Construction requires full modeling, code coordination, material testing, and licensed approval. Anyone who says otherwise is putting a deadline ahead of the work." Dr. Sloan made a note. Charles approached his microphone again. "She can repeat calculations prepared by others, but that does not establish authorship." Annie placed her father's compass beside the whiteboard. "You were right about one thing, Mr. Vance. I learned from your plans. I learned how many people could be failed when an architect protects his reputation instead of his design." His face tightened. "You took confidential material. You threw away drafts, ignored my reports, used my separation concept, and changed the material values afterward. That is false. Then explain why your office accessed the steel schedule before Revision 6 changed the connection capacity." Charles said nothing. Dr. Sloan looked toward Richard. "Do you have records supporting that statement?" Richard opened the evidence binder. "We have supplier documents, access logs, field photographs, restored emails, and Miss Brooks's dated notes." The procurement representative leaned toward the microphone. "Do those records also address North Star Development's involvement?" "Yes." Charles reached for his binder, but his attorney placed a hand over it. Dr. Sloan turned toward the clerk. "Enter all supporting records into the hearing file." Then she looked directly at Charles. Mr. Vance, remain available. This panel has additional questions. For the first time since entering the building, Charles no longer looked certain that his title would answer them for him. The clerk displayed the first exhibit on the main screen: Maria's photographs of the overnight steel deliveries. Each image included a date, truck number, shipment label, and beam stamp. Dr. Sloan turned toward Maria. Miss Alvarez, did you take these photographs? Yes. Why? Because the shipment labels didn't match the material schedule, and the trucks arrived outside normal inspection hours. Charles adjusted the microphone. A Site 4 woman is not qualified to interpret procurement documents. Maria looked at him. I didn't interpret them. I photographed what arrived. Your signature is on the receipt. The clerk enlarged the final image. Charles stood beside a Pacific Meridian truck while a beam was being unloaded. The date matched the first material substitution. Charles's attorney spoke before he could. Being present at a delivery does not establish knowledge of a technical discrepancy. Helen Park took the witness chair and opened the supplier report. Pacific Meridian Metals did not manufacture the steel, she said. It acted as a broker. The company was formed 11 months ago and has no long-term certification record. Its parent company, North Basin Consulting, shares an address with a firm managed by Mr. O.com, Vance's brother-in-law. The procurement representative asked, were the payments made directly? No, they were divided among 6 design change orders, each below the amount that would have required full board review. The payment schedule appeared on the screen. Richard recognized his authorization code beside 2 entries. Dr. Sloan looked at him. Did you approve these payments? I approved consolidated adjustments. I did not review the individual supplier records. So you were unaware of the connection? Yes. Do you consider that an adequate explanation? No. Several people turned toward him. Richard continued. It explains how the payments passed through my office. It does not excuse my failure to ask what I was signing. His attorney lowered his head, but Richard kept speaking. I trusted senior management to verify the details. That trust became an excuse for distance. My signature still released the money. Dr. Sloan made a note. The record will reflect your answer. Marcus Lee presented the server logs next. He explained how he preserved the data before Charles's team deleted the revision history. The entries showed Charles accessing the material schedule 6 times after the final review. Minutes later, connection capacities changed in the structural file. The steel grade listed in the summary remained higher than the material delivered to the site. Charles said, access records do not show who used the terminal. Marcus opened the badge report. Your badge entered the executive design floor at 11:42 p.m. The file was changed at 11:49. My staff used that floor, not that night. Their records show they had already left. Charles's attorney objected that the evidence required forensic authentication. The procurement representative agreed. It will be authenticated during the formal investigation. For today, it establishes sufficient cause for review. The clerk then displayed the recovered email fragment. Whitmore will not have a compliant structural package by Tuesday. Corrected system will be ready for North Star submission. Charles said, that message is incomplete. Richard answered from his table. Then provide the complete version. My legal team will respond through the appropriate process. Annie stood beside Samuel, holding her notebook against the navy blazer. Dr. Sloan asked her to approach the evidence screen. The clerk displayed Annie's hand-drawn separation concept beside the attachment reference from Charles's deleted email. Both used the same unusual title, Central Separation Concept. When did you create this? Dr. Sloan asked. Annie opened the original folded page. 3 months ago. The date is written at the top, and Samuel has an earlier photograph of it. Samuel submitted the photograph. Its metadata confirmed the date. Who received the drawing? Dr. Sloan asked. Charles Vance. Charles spoke at once. She showed me an informal sketch, based on my team's plans. Any similarity comes from the project itself. Annie faced him. Then explain why North Star's concept uses the same correction you said was unnecessary. It is a standard structural response. No, the standard response uses a different connection sequence. Mine separates the tower movement before it reaches the central frame. Charles opened his binder but did not find a page to support him. Annie continued, you told me I didn't understand the project. Then you sent my idea to the company competing against us. You have no proof I sent anything. Marcus raised the portable drive. The restored email archive includes the attachment transfer record. The clerk entered the final digital exhibit. Charles stopped arguing. The procurement representative requested the audio file recovered from an internal meeting. Richard warned the panel that the recording had not yet completed full forensic review, but Charles's attorney objected too late. The clerk played the relevant section. Charles's recorded voice filled the hall. No one is going to believe an 18-year-old black janitor over me. The sentence ended, leaving only the low sound of the recording system. Charles reached for his microphone. That statement has been removed from its context. Annie answered before the panel could. What context makes it acceptable? His attorney told him not to respond. Dr. Sloan addressed the audience. This panel will not determine criminal liability tonight. The financial records, server history, procurement files, and communications will be referred to federal and state investigators. Mr. Vance, you are instructed to remain available for questioning. Two compliance officers approached Charles's table. They did not place him under arrest. They asked him and his attorney to move to a private interview area. Charles gathered his binder. As he passed Annie, he lowered his voice. You think one presentation makes you an architect? Annie did not move aside. No, the work comes first. That's the part you forgot. Charles continued toward the officers without answering. Dr. Sloan called the hearing back to order. The Horizon 1 bid will not be approved or rejected tonight, she said. The project will enter a 90-day independent review. The conditions appeared on the screen. A full structural analysis, removal and testing of compromised materials, a procurement audit, independent safety oversight, protection for worker witnesses, review of Whitmore Global's internal governance. Eleanor Price stood from the board section. A 90-day delay may make the proposal financially impossible. Dr. Sloan replied, financial pressure does not change engineering standards. Richard rose. Whitmore Global accepts the review. Eleanor turned toward him. You are not authorized to speak for the board. I am speaking for my ownership interest and for the disclosure attached to the submission. If the company refuses independent review, I will support withdrawal. The board members exchanged looks. None challenged him publicly. Dr. Sloan asked Annie whether she wished to make a final statement. Annie stepped to the microphone. Do not approve Horizon 1 because you feel sorry for me. Do not lower a standard because of where I work or what I could not afford. She placed one hand on her notebook. Test every calculation, inspect every shipment, question every decision. If the design fails, reject it. She looked toward the board members. Justice is not making an exception for someone like me. Justice is applying the same honest measurement after people learn my name. Dr. Sloan nodded. That statement will remain in the official record. When the hearing ended, reporters gathered near the doors. Richard's communications team wanted Annie to stand beside him for photographs. She declined. This isn't a campaign, she said. The design still has to pass. Richard dismissed the team. He found Annie near the exit with Evelyn, Samuel, Maria, and the workers who had submitted their notes. Thank you, he said. Annie adjusted the notebook under her arm. Gratitude isn't a contract. I know. What happens next? A 90-day review, a board investigation, and several conversations I should have had years ago. And after that, Richard looked toward the plans being sealed into evidence containers. That depends on what survives the truth. Annie nodded. Then start there. She left with her mother and the people who had helped preserve the record. By morning, the country knew Annie Brooks's name. The harder work was creating a future in which the next person like her would not need a billionaire to arrive at 2 a.m. before anyone listened. 90 days later, the independent review team delivered its findings in a public report more than 800 pages long. The original Horizon 1 design had failed 3 separate structural tests. The West core steel did not meet the values listed in the final summary. The central transfer frame carried more rotational demand than the submitted model admitted, and several material approvals had passed through companies with undisclosed ties to Charles Vance. Annie's corrective concept survived every major test. It was not accepted without changes. Samuel Carter and the independent engineers expanded the foundation system, refined the damping sequence, and completed the code analysis that Annie had always said was still required. Her central idea remained intact: allow the towers to respond separately before transferring controlled force into the shared frame. Dr. Rebecca Sloan announced the decision at a public meeting. Horizon 1 may proceed under independent technical and procurement oversight. All compromised materials must be removed. No construction package may be approved without external review. Richard stood beside the Whitmore Global Board but did not speak until the findings had been read in full. When a reporter asked whether he considered the result a victory, he answered, "A victory would have been catching this before workers had to risk their careers, and Annie had to prove the same facts repeatedly. This is accountability. We should not confuse the two." The board investigation led to the resignation of 5 senior executives. Eleanor Price stepped down as chair after internal records showed she had supported removing Annie's name from the public submission even after the design team verified her calculations. Grant Wallace retained a position in the company, but no longer held authority over technical authorship or safety review. He later gave a formal statement acknowledging that he had treated Annie's public credibility as a greater risk than the failures she exposed. Charles Vance and several associates were indicted after investigators authenticated the financial records, deleted messages, and transfer logs. The charges included fraud, bid manipulation, theft of design information, destruction of records, and reckless professional conduct. North Star Development was removed from the national bidding process. Richard returned as chief executive under conditions he once would have rejected. Whitmore Global accepted an independent safety board with seats for engineers, union representatives, field supervisors, and community members. Worker reports could no longer be closed by administrative staff without technical review. Procurement changes above a reduced threshold required outside verification, and the name of every design contributor had to remain attached to the project history. Richard signed the agreement without negotiating any of those terms. 3 days after the final review, he met Annie, Evelyn, Samuel, and Maria at a community college conference office. Richard placed a tuition proposal on the table. "This covers your degree, required software, transportation, and a paid position with the supervised design team." Annie read the first page. "Paid by you personally?" "Yes." She closed the folder. "Then no." Richard did not argue. "Tell me why. I don't want my education tied to one person's gratitude. If we disagree later, I don't want anyone saying I owe my future to your generosity. You think I would use it that way? I think power changes the meaning of favors, even when the person offering them has good intentions." Samuel nodded. "She's right." Richard took the folder back. "What would you accept?" "A program with an independent board, clear requirements, the same opportunity available to other people who had to leave school because they could not afford to stay." Maria added, "Include workers returning for certification. A lot of experienced people know the work but never had access to the formal path," Evelyn said, "and paid internships. People cannot study full-time if the program requires them to stop earning." Richard listened, wrote down each condition, and asked questions instead of making another speech. 6 months later, the Daniel Brooks Design and Trades Fellowship opened. Its board included Samuel, Maria, 2 college representatives, a union training director, an independent accountant, and Annie. Whitmore Global provided the first endowment but did not control admissions. The fellowship funded tuition, software, certification programs, transportation, and paid professional placements. Annie became its first architecture recipient, though she insisted her application pass through the same review process as every other candidate. Samuel remained her technical supervisor. He never allowed the attention surrounding Horizon 1 to excuse weak work. One afternoon, Annie handed him a studio project she had revised 3 times. Samuel marked a connection in red pencil. "This load path stops here. It transfers through the wall. Show it. It's implied. Concrete does not respect implication." Annie took the drawing back. "You could have said the rest was good. The rest being good is why this mistake matters." She returned the next morning with the correction. 4 years after the hearing, the first district of Horizon 1 opened in Los Angeles. The completed area included housing, medical offices, public transit connections, training facilities, and the Central Design Center funded through the new fellowship. The west core beams had been removed and replaced under independent supervision. Every structural revision was available in a public technical archive. Evelyn attended the opening in a blue dress she had saved since Annie's graduation. Maria arrived with retired ironworkers and field supervisors, who had contributed records during the investigation. Samuel carried Daniel Brooks's steel ruler in the inside pocket of his jacket. Richard remained several steps behind the main platform while Annie delivered the opening address. She had completed her degree and was working through the professional experience required for licensure. Her official role on the current Horizon 1 documents read, Annie Brooks, Architectural Design Associate. She did not describe herself as a miracle. She spoke about verification, access, and the cost of dismissing people before examining their work. Talent is not rare because only a few people have it, she said. It appears rare because opportunity keeps searching in the same places. After the ceremony, Richard joined Annie inside the Central Design Center. A section of unfinished concrete had been preserved behind clear protective glass. White lines still crossed its surface. Foundation values, support symbols, connection points, and the first version of Annie's corrective structure. Up black beside it read, Annie's wall. The future of Horizon 1 was first redrawn here after midnight by a worker whose warning had been ignored. Richard stood beside her. I thought you were damaging my wall. Annie examined the chalk line where the West Core correction began. I was showing you what was already broken behind it. He took her old cleaning badge from his coat pocket. The rain damage had blurred part of her name, but he had kept it. I never gave this back. Annie accepted the badge and turned it over in her hand. Do you still think I discovered you? He asked. No. Richard smiled slightly. Good. You found me because you finally went somewhere your reports couldn't speak for you. That sounds less flattering. It's more accurate. He nodded toward the design center. Did I at least open the right door? Annie placed the damaged badge beside the framed copy of her first calculations. You didn't save me, Richard. You stopped standing in the doorway. Across the room, a group of new fellowship recipients gathered around drafting tables and computer stations. Some had left college years earlier. Others came from construction crews, maintenance departments, community colleges, and families that had never been able to finance professional training. One woman remained near an empty drafting sheet, uncertain where to begin. Annie walked over, placed a sharpened pencil beside the paper and said, Start with what you know. We'll test the rest. The pencil moved across the page. This time, no one had to work in the dark before being heard. This story reminds us that talent, courage, and integrity can appear in places society often overlooks. A person's job title, age, race, or financial situation should never determine whether their voice deserves to be heard. True leadership is not about protecting power or reputation. It is about admitting mistakes, defending the truth, and giving people fair credit for their work. Justice begins when we stop judging people by their position and start measuring them by their character, ability, and actions. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.